Hey guys, tonight we are peeling back the layers of time, way back, to a world that laid the very first. Wobbly stones for an idea that still makes politicians sweat and keyboard warriors type furiously, democracy. We're venturing into ancient Athens, but not the shiny Parthenon-topped version you see on postcards. Oh no, we're going further back, to a time when the idea of a people power was probably just a strange dream whispered by a very tired farmer. You're standing on the dusty, sun-baked earth of Attica, the region surrounding Athens, somewhere around the 7th century BCE. The air is thick with the scent of wild thyme, goat, and the faint, ever-present aroma of wood smoke. Look around you. The hills are dotted with olive groves, their silvery leaves shimmering in the Mediterranean haze, and small, scattered farmsteads cling to the rocky soil. This isn't a bustling metropolis yet. Think more of a loose collection of villages gradually coalescing around a prominent rocky outcrop called the Acropolis. And let me tell you, if you were suddenly dropped here, your modern sensibilities and, frankly, your inability to till a field with a wooden plow, mean you probably wouldn't survive this for a week. You'd be utterly bewildered by the lack of Wi-Fi. For starters. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe channel, History for Sleep, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. It's always lovely to know who's drifting off with us. Go ahead and post your location and what time it is where you are. It's always fascinating to see our community of night owls and history buffs. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You feel the grit of the path under your simple leather sandals. It's early. The Aegean sun already promising a baking kind of day. You're not a tourist here, there are no air-conditioned buses, no helpful guides with brightly colored umbrellas. You are, for tonight's purposes, a soul drifting through this ancient landscape, observing, listening. The dominant sounds are the bleating of distant sheep, the rhythmic clink of a blacksmith's hammer from a nearby settlement, and the low hum of cicadas already tuning up for their daily symphony. This is archaic Athens. A good century or more before anyone utters the word demokratia. Power, land, and pretty much everything else worth having, are concentrated in the hands of a select few, the aristocrats. Known as the Eupatridae, literally, the well-fathered, or sons of good fathers. Think of them as the original old boys club, claiming descent from legendary heroes and gods, which, let's be honest, is a pretty solid way to justify why you own all the best land and everyone else is doing the backbreaking work. It's like saying your great-great-great-grandpappy was best mates with Zeus, so naturally, you get the corner office and the biggest olive grove. You see a group of these Eupatridae now. Perhaps near a modest, early version of an agora, the marketplace that would one day become the heart of Athenian public life. They are distinguished by their finer tunics. Perhaps a touch of dye in the fabric, a sign of wealth. They carry themselves with an air of effortless superiority, discussing land boundaries, grain prices, or perhaps the upcoming religious festival. Their power isn't just economic, it's political and judicial too. The main governing body is the Areopagus Council, a formidable assembly of ex-archons, or chief magistrates. These archons, typically 9 of them, are drawn exclusively from the Eupatridae families. Imagine a government run by a self-perpetuating board of directors who all went to the same very exclusive, very ancient school, and whose families have known each other, and probably intermarried for generations. That's the political landscape you're witnessing. Historians still argue whether the Areopagus in this very early period was a fully formalized council with strictly defined powers or a more fluid advisory body of elders. But its influence was undeniable. It was the ultimate authority, the keeper of laws, which, by the way, weren't even written down yet for everyone to see, and the decider of major disputes. Now, shift your gaze from these privileged few to the figures who make up the vast majority of the population. You see them scattered across the countryside, their backs bent under the sun. These are the small farmers, the tenants, and the landless laborers. Many of them are hectomoroi, or sixth parters. This rather unfortunate title meant they worked land owned by an aristocrat and had to hand over a sixth of their produce as rent. It sounds just about manageable, perhaps. Until you factor in bad harvests, droughts, or an unexpected goat illness. One bad year, and that sixth becomes a crushing burden. And if they couldn't pay? Well, the consequences were dire. Debt bondage was a very real and terrifying prospect. You, your wife, your children, could be reduced to servitude, effectively becoming slaves to your creditor. To work off a debt that might never truly be cleared. It's a system designed to keep the poor, poor, and the rich, well, eupatridae. There's a grim sort of stability to it all. The stability of a very lopsided pyramid. You might pass a humble dwelling, a simple structure of sun-dried mud bricks and a thatched roof. Inside, life is basic. A hearth for cooking. Some clay pots for storage, woven mats for sleeping. The diet is predominantly barley porridge, olives, figs, a bit of cheese if you're lucky, and watered-down wine. Meat is a rare luxury. You can almost smell the wood smoke clinging to the rough wool of their clothes. There's a stoicism in their faces, the ingrained resilience of people who live close to the edge. Dependent on the whims of weather and the demands of their landlords. You try to imagine their hopes and fears. Perhaps they pray to Demeter for a good harvest. Or to a local nymph for the health of their children. The idea of having a say in how the community is run, of challenging the authority of the well-fathered, would seem almost laughably outlandish. Like suggesting a goat could fly. Yet, even in this rigid world, there are currents of change, almost imperceptible at first, like underground springs. Trade is slowly expanding. Athens, with its 3 natural harbors, is beginning to look outwards. Small merchants and craftsmen are emerging, a nascent middle class, perhaps, who don't fit neatly into the old land-based aristocracy versus peasant-farmer dynamic. They might not own vast estates, but they have skills, goods, and a growing awareness of the world beyond Attica's borders. They travel, they hear stories from other city-states, some of which are already experimenting with different forms of governance. These whispers, these new perspectives, are like seeds falling on stony ground, but a few might just find a crack to take root. One quirky tidbit from this era is the Athenian obsession with olive oil. It was more than just food, it was fuel for lamps, a cleanser. They didn't have soap. So they'd rub themselves with oil and then scrape it off with a tool called a strigil, taking dirt and sweat with it. Sounds delightful on a hot day, doesn't it? A base for perfumes. And a prize in athletic contests. The sacred olive tree on the Acropolis, said to have been a gift from the goddess Athena herself, symbolized the city's prosperity. Messing with an olive tree, especially one of the sacred ones, was a serious offense. So, while our eupatridae are busy consolidating power, and the hectomoroi are struggling to survive, everyone, at least, can agree on the supreme importance of a good olive. It's the great unifier, like complaining about the weather or arguing about the best way to make a cup of tea. The social tension is palpable, even if it's mostly unvoiced. You can feel it in the deference shown to the aristocrats, a deference tinged perhaps with a hint of resentment. Imagine seeing your children go hungry while the lord of the estate enjoys a lavish feast. Imagine knowing that no matter how hard you work, you're unlikely to ever improve your lot significantly. And that your fate is largely determined by birth. This isn't a sustainable situation, not in the long run. The pressure is building, slowly but surely. The traditional bonds of kinship and patronage are being strained by economic hardship and a growing sense of injustice. The mainstream historical fact of this period is that this societal structure, with the eupatridae holding all the cards and a large portion of the populace in precarious economic positions, including debt bondage, was creating an unstable environment ripe for conflict. This wasn't just about a few disgruntled farmers, it was a systemic issue. The very fabric of Attic society was being stretched thin. You might see a father explaining to his son why they must give so much of their barley harvest to the landowner, his voice low and careful. Or perhaps you witness a heated, though quickly suppressed, argument at a well over water rights. These are the small cracks appearing in the edifice of aristocratic control. There are no public protests yet. No revolutionary pamphlets being secretly printed. Printing is still about 2 millennia away, so settle down. But the discontent is there, a low hum beneath the surface of daily life. It's the kind of quiet desperation that, if left unaddressed, can eventually erupt. The aristocrats, secure in their inherited power, might dismiss these rumblings as the usual grumbling of the lower orders. They probably thought, well, someone has to be in charge, and it's clearly us. The chaps with the fancy ancestors and the well-oiled hair. A bit of a historical oversight on their part, as future generations would demonstrate. As the sun begins to dip lower, casting long shadows across the fields, you reflect on this ancient world. It's a place of stark contrasts, the beauty of the landscape against the harshness of life for many. The entrenched power of the few against the silent struggles of the majority. There's a sense of inevitability in the air, a feeling that something has to give. This archaic Athens, with its rigid hierarchies and simmering grievances, is not the final chapter. It's a prelude, a tense and often uncomfortable overture to a much grander, and far more radical symphony of change that is waiting in the wings. The stage is being set for figures who will attempt to bring order, sometimes through even harsher means. Before others dare to dream of redistributing not just grain, but power itself. The memory of this time, the good old days for the Eupatridae, would serve as a stark reminder for future Athenians of what they were moving away from, and why the struggles for reform were so vital. You can almost hear the first faint, hesitant notes of a new song, one that will eventually be sung by many voices, not just a select few. But that's a story for just a little later. For now, the cicadas are quieting, and the first stars are beginning to prick the darkening sky over Attica. The air in Athens, still thick with that archaic dust and the scent of time you remember, now carries a new tension. The quiet desperation you witnessed. That low hum of discontent from the hectomoroi and other struggling folk, has begun to bubble a little closer to the surface. Those Eupatridae, the well-fathered aristocrats we saw earlier, are perhaps feeling a bit less secure in their sandals. When social order frays, when the grumbling gets a little too loud, the powerful often look for ways to reassert control. Sometimes it's through appeasement, sometimes through a show of force, and sometimes, just sometimes, it's through the rather novel idea of actually writing things down. You're now drifting into a time, around 621 BCE, when one man steps forward, or is pushed forward, depending on which historian you ask, to try and bring some semblance of order to the increasingly fractious city-state. His name is Draco. Now, Draco isn't coming in with a message of peace, love, and understanding. Oh no. Draco is more of a, cross this line and you'll deeply regret it, probably with your life, kind of guy. His primary claim to fame, the reason his name has echoed through millennia, is his legal code. For the first time in Athens, the laws are to be written down, inscribed perhaps on wooden tablets called axons. Possibly rotating ones, so everyone, well, everyone who could read, which wasn't, you know, everyone, could theoretically know what they were. This, in itself, was a pretty big deal. Remember those unwritten laws, interpreted by the Eupatridae-dominated Areopagus? Having laws written down meant that justice, at least in theory, was no longer entirely at the whim of a magistrate who might just happen to dislike the cut of your tunic or the fact your goat wandered into his prize-winning olive grove. It provided a fixed point of reference. So, a tentative thumbs up for transparency, Athens. Small steps. But then you get to the content of Draco's laws. And this is where his name became synonymous with extreme severity. The phrase, draconian, still gets tossed around today to describe any rule or punishment that seems excessively harsh. Like a library fine that requires you to donate a kidney. Legend has it that Draco's laws were said to be written not in ink, but in blood. And while that's probably a dramatic flourish, it captures the spirit of the thing. The most famous aspect of his code was its liberal application of the death penalty. Steal a cabbage? Death. Loiter with intent to appear vaguely shiftless? Probably death. Okay, maybe not for loitering, but the range of offenses carrying capital punishment was startlingly wide. Demades, a later orator, quipped that Draco's laws were written in blood because he believed small offenses deserved death, and he had no greater punishment for the really serious ones. It's a grim sort of punchline, isn't it? You can imagine the atmosphere as these laws are promulgated. Perhaps you're standing in the agora, watching as the axioms are set up. There's a crowd gathered, a mix of curiosity, apprehension, and perhaps a sliver of hope among some that clear rules, any rules, are better than the arbitrary justice of before. But as the implications of the penalties sink in, a chill likely descends. For the struggling farmer, already on the edge, the thought that a desperate act to feed his family could result in his execution must have been terrifying. It's like trying to walk a tightrope over a pit of vipers, where the tightrope is greased, and someone is occasionally shaking it for laughs. The mainstream historical fact here is the very existence of this written code and its notorious harshness, especially concerning theft and homicide. While many of the specific laws attributed to Draco were later reformed or replaced by Solon, our next major stop on this sleepy tour, his law on homicide was apparently retained for a long time. This law distinguished between intentional and unintentional killing, which was a significant legal development. Moving away from purely personal vendettas and blood feuds towards a more state-regulated system of justice. So, even amidst the blood and guts reputation, there were seeds of legal sophistication. Historians still argue whether Draco's primary aim was to brutally suppress the lower classes on behalf of the aristocracy, or if his intention was more to curb the power of the aristocratic families themselves by limiting their ability to conduct personal vendettas and by establishing the state as the ultimate arbiter of justice. By making even murder a matter for the state and its courts, rather than endless cycles of revenge between powerful clans, he might have been trying to forge a more stable, albeit terrifyingly policed, community. Perhaps it was a bit of both. An attempt to impose order from above that would inevitably protect the status quo, but also lay down a marker that no one, not even a eupatrid, was entirely above a codified law when it came to certain crimes like homicide. Now, for a quirky tidbit about Draco himself. Details about his life are incredibly scarce. He's one of those figures who walks onto the historical stage, does one very dramatic thing, and then pretty much vanishes. But later Greek writers, never ones to let a lack of facts get in the way of a good story, offered a rather peculiar account of his death. According to Plutarch, writing many centuries later, Draco traveled to the nearby island of Aegina. While attending a theatrical performance there, presumably something less grim than his legal code, he was so beloved and respected by the Aeginetans, which is slightly surprising, given his reputation, that they showered him with approval in the traditional ancient Greek way, by throwing their hats and cloaks upon him. So many hats and cloaks, in fact, that the old lawmaker was supposedly smothered to death beneath the pile of well-intentioned haberdashery, suffocated by enthusiasm. It's a wonderfully absurd image, like being hugged to death by a particularly affectionate octopus. Whether it's true or just a colorful anecdote to make a rather stern figure seem a bit more human, or at least have a more interesting exit, is anyone's guess. It does make you wonder what the health and safety regulations were for public displays of affection in ancient Greek theaters. Please, citizens, applaud responsibly. We don't want another Draco incident. You try to picture life under these laws. Does petty crime plummet? Perhaps. But at what cost? Does the constant threat of a brutal death foster a sense of civic peace, or does it just drive discontent further underground, making it simmer with even greater intensity? You might see a merchant carefully locking his stall, not just with one bolt, but 3. You might observe a street argument that quickly fizzles out. Both parties suddenly remembering that even a heated dispute, if it escalated, could have unimaginably severe consequences under the new rules. There's a new quietness, perhaps. But it's the quiet of fear, not of contentment. It's like everyone is walking on eggshells, if the eggshells were made of highly sensitive explosive material. Imagine the anxiety of a parent whose child, in a moment of youthful foolishness, nicks an apple from a stall. Before, it might have resulted in a clout round the ear or a stern talking to from a magistrate. Now, the shadow of Draco's axe looms. It's a heavy burden for a society to bear. And you have to wonder about the enforcers of these laws. Did they carry out their duties with grim satisfaction, or with a heavy heart? It's easy to imagine the first few public examples being made. The shock and horror rippling through the community. This wasn't the good old days of informal justice anymore. This was something new, something stark. And something terrifyingly permanent if you ended up on the wrong side of it. The economic woes you saw earlier, the plight of the hectomoroi. The debt slaves, Draco's laws didn't really address these fundamental issues. They mostly focused on criminal offenses and the procedures for dealing with them. So, while you might be less likely to get randomly shanked in a blood feud, which is a plus, I suppose, you're still just as likely to lose your land and your freedom if you fall into debt. It's like putting a very strong, very scary lock on the front door of a house whose foundations are crumbling. The lock might deter burglars. But it's not going to stop the house from eventually falling down. Draco's intervention, harsh as it was, represents a critical, if uncomfortable, step in Athens' journey. It underscored the need for some kind of publicly acknowledged legal framework. It showed that laws could be separated from the direct, personal authority of individual aristocrats. But it also demonstrated, quite brutally, that order imposed without a broader sense of fairness or an attempt to address underlying social and economic injustices was unlikely to be a lasting solution. The memory of Draco's blood-soaked axioms would linger, a stark reminder that while the rule of law is essential, the nature of those laws matters immensely. The stage was set for someone else to try a different approach, someone who might understand that you can't just scare people into a stable society. You also have to give them a reason to believe in it. The air is still heavy, but now it's not just with the dust of ages, but with the metallic tang of fear and the silent prayer for a less lethal form of justice. That metallic tang of fear you tasted under Draco's rule, that sense of everyone treading on explosive eggshells, hasn't really dissipated. If anything, the underlying problems in Athenian society have festered. Remember those hectomoroi, the sixth parters, toiling away and handing over a hefty slice of their livelihood? And the ever-present threat of debt bondage, where one bad harvest could see you and your family becoming property? Draco's laws, for all their bloody-minded clarity, did precious little to address these deep economic wounds. They were a harsh sticking plaster on a gaping wound that needed proper surgery. So, the pressure continues to build. The rich Eupatridae are still rich, though perhaps a little nervous about the simmering resentment from below. The poor are still poor, and getting poorer, and increasingly desperate. The situation is, to use a technical historical term, a total mess, teetering on the brink of outright civil war. The air is thick not just with wood smoke and time anymore, but with the palpable threat of social implosion. You can almost hear the sharpening of metaphorical knives, and possibly some literal ones too. Into this highly charged atmosphere steps a figure who is less about wielding a bloody axe and more about, well, trying to talk some sense into everyone while also making some pretty radical changes. You're now witnessing the arrival of Solon, around the year 594 BCE. He's chosen as an archon. But not just any archon, he's given special powers as a mediator, a kind of emergency fixer-upper for a city-state that's about to fall apart at the seams. Think of him as the ancient Greek equivalent of a high-stakes negotiator, brought in when everyone else is just shouting at each other and threatening to flip the monopoly board. He's an aristocrat himself, a eupatrid, but one known for his wisdom, his moderate views, and, crucially, his poetry. More on that later. He's not universally loved at first. When you're trying to find a middle ground between people who want to keep all their privileges and people who want to, eat, you're bound to annoy someone. Solon's first, and arguably most famous, act is something called the Pisistratus. It literally means the shaking off of burdens. And what a shake-up it was. He effectively cancels all outstanding debts for which land or personal liberty was the security. Poof. Gone. Imagine your mortgage or your crippling student loans just vanishing overnight. That's the kind of seismic impact we're talking about. All those horoi, those marker stones on land indicating it was pledged for debt, are pulled up. People enslaved for debt within Attica are freed. Those sold abroad are, where possible, to be bought back. This is monumental. For the hectomoroi and others crushed by debt. It's like a literal weight being lifted from their shoulders. You can almost feel a collective sigh of relief rippling through the Attic countryside. It's not quite a free ponies for everyone policy, but it's a massive step away from the brink. This Pisistratus is a cornerstone mainstream historical fact of Solon's reforms. A bold move to defuse an explosive crisis. But Solon doesn't stop there. He understands that just wiping the slate clean isn't enough if you don't change the system that created the mess in the first place. So, he tackles the very structure of Athenian society. He abolishes the hereditary privileges of the eupatridae as the sole qualification for office. Instead, he introduces a new system, dividing all citizens into 4 classes based on their agricultural wealth, specifically the annual yield of their land in measures of grain, wine, or oil, those beloved olives again. These classes are 1. The Pentecosiometimnoi, the 500 measure men, the wealthiest, who could produce at least 500 metimnoi, a unit of measure, roughly 52 liters, of goods. These guys are still the top dogs, eligible for the highest offices like archon and a place in the Areopagus. 2. The hippias, the horsemen or knights, who could afford to maintain a warhorse, producing 300 to 500 metimnoi. They also get access to high office. 3. The Zugetai, the yokemen, who owned a pair of oxen for plowing, producing 200 to 300 metimnoi. These are your middling farmers. The backbone of the hoplite army. They can now hold minor offices and, crucially, participate in the assembly. 4. The Thetes, the poorest class, producing less than 200 metimnoi. Or landless laborers. They can't hold office, but Solon grants them the right to participate and vote in the assembly, ecclesia and to serve on juries in the new popular court, the Heliaea. This is a huge deal, giving even the poorest citizens a voice, however small initially, in public affairs and the judicial process. This new class system based on wealth, demokratia, not birth, is revolutionary. It means that, in theory, a non-eupatrid who becomes wealthy enough could rise to the highest echelons of power. It cracks open the closed shop of aristocratic rule. Of course, it's not exactly equality for all, the rich still have way more power. It's more like changing the entry requirements for the VIP club from "Who's your daddy?" to "How many olives can your daddy grow?" Still exclusive, but a different kind of exclusive. Solon also overhauls the legal system. He repeals almost all of Draco's laws, keeping only the homicide law, which, as we saw, had some merits. He publishes his new laws on those axioms for everyone to see. One key innovation is the right of any citizen to bring a prosecution on behalf of someone else who had been wronged. This meant that the weak or vulnerable weren't solely reliant on their own ability to seek justice. And the establishment of the Heliaea, a popular court of appeal, meant that decisions made by magistrates weren't necessarily the final word. Citizens could have their cases heard by their peers. Imagine the impact of this. Suddenly, you have a recourse. A potential check on the power of the powerful. Now, for that quirky tidbit, Solon wasn't just a lawmaker, he was a poet. And thankfully, fragments of his poetry survive. He used his verses to explain and defend his reforms, to comment on the state of Athenian society, and to express his political philosophy. It's like if a modern politician released their policy statements as a series of angsty indie folk songs. He writes about the greed of the wealthy and the suffering of the poor, and his desire to stand between the warring factions like a boundary stone. His poetry gives us a fascinating personal insight into his motivations. He wasn't just some dry administrator. He was a thinker, a communicator, grappling with complex issues and trying to articulate his vision for a more balanced society. Some lines even suggest he was offered tyrannical power but refused it. Which, if true, makes him a rather rare breed of politician. Of course, Solon's reforms didn't magically make everyone happy. That's the problem with compromise. Extremists on both sides tend to feel cheated. The die-hard aristocrats were furious that their ancestral privileges were being curtailed and that debtors had been let off the hook. They probably muttered about socialism and the good old days when a chap knew his place. On the other hand, many of the poorest citizens were disappointed that Solon didn't go further and redistribute land. They'd had their debts cancelled, which was great, but they still didn't own the fields they worked. It's like getting your overdraft cleared but still not having a job. Historians still argue whether Solon saw himself as a radical democrat paving the way for popular rule, or as a conservative aristocrat doing the bare minimum necessary to prevent a total societal collapse and preserve a modified form of elite governance. What was his ultimate vision? Was he trying to create a just society, or just a less likely to explode one? The debate continues, and it makes you appreciate that historical figures are rarely simple heroes or villains. Solon also reportedly introduced economic reforms aimed at boosting Athens' prosperity. He encouraged the cultivation of cash crops like olives and grapes, which were great for export. Rather than relying solely on grain, Attica wasn't great for growing vast quantities of grain anyway. He may have reformed weights and measures to facilitate trade. There's even a story that he offered citizenship to skilled craftsmen who would relocate to Athens with their families, a clever way to boost the city's know-how and economic base. Though, like many details from this period, the exact nature and impact of these economic policies are subject to scholarly discussion. Did he ban all food exports except olive oil, as some sources suggest? That seems a bit drastic, but it highlights the focus on making Athens an economic player. You can imagine the city in the years after Solon's reforms. There's a new energy, perhaps, but also a new set of uncertainties. The hectomoroi are gone as a class, debt slavery is abolished. The Vites can go to the assembly and the law courts. These are profound changes. But old habits die hard. The Eupatridae haven't just vanished, they're still wealthy and influential. And new political factions are beginning to emerge. Based not just on old family ties but on regional interests and differing views on how Solon's constitution should work in practice. You might see a former debt slave walking a little taller. A Thete heading to the Pnyx hill with a newfound sense of purpose, even if he's not entirely sure what he'll do when he gets there. You might also overhear grumbling in the finer parts of town about how things are going to the dogs and how all this people power nonsense is going to ruin everything. It's the ancient equivalent of complaining about avocado toast bankrupting millennials. Solon himself, according to Herodotus, Having made the Athenians swear to uphold his laws for 10 years, some say 100, decided the best thing to do was to leave town. He went traveling for a decade. Apparently to avoid being pestered into changing his laws. A bit like an IT guy who fixes your computer and then immediately goes on an extended vacation so you can't ask him any follow-up questions. He visited Egypt and Cyprus, and famously, according to legend, met with King Croesus of Lydia, leading to that famous conversation about who is truly the happiest man. Spoiler: it wasn't the rich king. His absence, however, didn't mean Athens settled into peaceful, harmonious stability. His reforms had opened Pandora's box in some ways, unleashing new ambitions and new conflicts. The shaking off of burdens was a vital, necessary step. The creation of wealth-based classes was an innovative move away from pure aristocracy. But by not fully satisfying any single group, and by creating new avenues for political participation without a fully developed democratic machinery, Solon inadvertently set the stage for the next chapter of Athenian political drama, the rise of the tyrants. His laws were a foundation, but the building was far from complete. And the construction site was about to get a lot more complicated. The taste of fear from Draco's time is slowly being replaced by the more complex flavors of cautious optimism, lingering resentment, and the fizz of political maneuvering. So, Solon, our wise poet-lawmaker, did his best to untangle Athens' socio-economic knot with his Sysacthia and his new wealth-based classes. He shook off those burdens, gave the little guy a tiny voice in the assembly, and then, rather conveniently, went on a very long holiday, perhaps hoping everyone would just figure out how to get along. Bless his optimistic cotton tunic. But as you're probably guessing, Athens didn't just magically transform into a harmonious utopia where everyone held hands and sang Kumbaya around the olive groves. Old habits, old rivalries, and old desires for just a little bit more power than the next chap, died very, very hard. The ink on Solon's axons was barely dry, metaphorically speaking. Before new factions started to coalesce, each with their own agenda, each convinced they knew what was best for Athens, and, coincidentally, for themselves. You're still drifting through Athens. And the years have ticked by since Solon's reforms took hold in 594 BCE. The initial relief of the debt cancellation has faded, and the city is now a simmering pot of political intrigue. Three main groups have emerged, like rival bands vying for the top spot on the Acropolis charts. First, you have the men of the plain. These are largely your landed aristocrats. The Eupatridae old guard, who still think Solon went too far and are grumbling about the good old days when their birthright meant everything. Then there are the men of the coast, representing the merchants, artisans, and those whose wealth came from trade, a more mixed bunch, perhaps looking for stability and commercial opportunities. And finally, you have the men of the hills, the poorer farmers and laborers from the Attic countryside, many of whom felt Solon hadn't gone far enough. They wanted more land, more relief. It's a classic three-way standoff, and the political atmosphere is about as stable as a unicycle on a tightrope during a mild earthquake. Into this fractious environment steps a figure who is charismatic, ambitious, and more than a little cunning, Peisistratus. He's an aristocrat himself, related to Solon even. But he positions himself as the champion of those men of the hills, the underdog, if you will. He's got a knack for PR, this Peisistratus. His first attempt to seize power is quite theatrical. According to Herodotus, he wounds himself and his mules, then drives into the agora claiming he's been attacked by his political enemies and needs protection. The assembly, perhaps moved by this rather dramatic display, or maybe just a bit gullible, grants him a bodyguard of club bearers. It's like faking an injury to get a penalty in a football match, and then demanding the referee give you a personal security detail. Naturally, he uses these club bearers not just for protection, but to seize the Acropolis and declare himself ruler, around 561 BCE. Now, the word tyrant, tyrannos, in ancient Greece didn't have the same purely negative ring it does today. It generally referred to someone who seized power unconstitutionally, often with popular support, rather than necessarily being a brutal oppressor. Peisistratus wasn't like some cartoon villain stroking a fluffy white cat and cackling maniacally. In fact, for much of his rule, he was surprisingly popular. But his path to securing that rule was a bit of a roller coaster. He gets kicked out of Athens not once, but twice, by coalitions of his rivals. This guy had more comebacks than a beloved rock band on a perpetual farewell tour. His second return to power is the stuff of legend, and a fantastic quirky tidbit. After his first exile, he conspires with Megacles, a leader of the coastal faction. To make his return seem divinely sanctioned, they find a tall, striking woman from a local village named Phi. They dress her up in armor, put her in a chariot, and parade her into Athens, with heralds announcing that the goddess Athena herself is bringing Peisistratus back. You can just imagine it. Make way! Make way! The goddess of wisdom says this guy is totally legit. And apparently, many Athenians bought it, or at least were sufficiently impressed or bewildered to let him back in. It's an audacious piece of political theater, a sort of divine publicity stunt. Historians still argue whether the Athenians were genuinely fooled or if they were in on the charade. Perhaps seeing it as a symbolic endorsement rather than a literal divine intervention. Either way, it worked, for a while. He gets exiled again, but then, like a persistent houseguest you just can't get rid of, he comes back a third time, this time with mercenary troops and a more solid grip on power, around 546 BCE. Third time's the charm, eh? Once he's firmly in charge, Peisistratus doesn't actually dismantle Solon's laws. He lets the constitution largely stand, the assembly still meets. Magistrates are still appointed, though he makes sure his friends and family get key positions, a bit of ancient Greek cronyism, if you will. His tyranny is more about pulling the strings from behind the scenes while maintaining an appearance of legality. This is a mainstream historical fact about his rule. He governed with a relatively light touch for a tyrant, focusing on policies that would benefit the common people, particularly his power base among the rural poor. He offered loans to small farmers, helping them develop their land and become more productive, perhaps a subtle way of ensuring they didn't need to look to aristocratic landlords for support. He also instituted a system of traveling judges to settle disputes in the countryside, making justice more accessible and further reducing the local influence of the eupatridae. Peisistratus also embarks on a significant program of public works. This is a classic move for rulers wanting to win hearts and minds, and provide jobs. He beautifies Athens, constructing new temples, like the beginnings of the Temple of Olympian Zeus, and public buildings. He improves the water supply with fountains, like the Enneakronos, the nine-piped fountain house, which was a big deal for a city needing fresh water. Think of it as an ancient urban renewal project. These projects not only provided employment but also fostered a sense of civic pride. Athens was starting to look and feel like an important city. It's like when your town finally gets that new bypass and a slightly less terrible shopping center. You grumble, but deep down, you're a tiny bit pleased. Culturally, Peisistratus and his sons, who succeed him, are also very active. They are credited with promoting and expanding major festivals, particularly the Panathenea, a grand festival in honor of Athena, which included athletic contests, musical competitions, and recitations of epic poetry. It's believed that under Peisistratus, the first official recensions, versions, of Homer's Iliad and Odyssey were commissioned, ensuring these epic poems were preserved and became central to Greek culture. He also supported the festival of Dionysus, the city Dionysia, which became the main venue for an exciting new art form, tragic drama. So, while he might have been an autocrat, he was an autocrat with a taste for culture and spectacle, understanding that a happy and entertained populace is less likely to cause trouble. It's the ancient bread and circuses idea, but with more poetry and slightly less gladiatorial combat. So, you're in Athens under Peisistratus. The city is more orderly, perhaps more prosperous than it was during the chaotic factional struggles after Solon. For the average farmer or artisan, life might even be a bit better. There's work, there's access to loans. The festivals are grander. Peisistratus himself is said to have been approachable, wandering the city and talking to ordinary people. But it's still one-man rule. The democratic potential in Solon's reforms is, for now, on hold, or at least carefully managed by the tyrant and his family. Historians still argue whether Peisistratus was a genuinely benevolent populist leader who had the interests of the demos, the common people, at heart. Or if he was primarily a clever and self-serving autocrat who used popular policies as a means to consolidate his personal power and dynastic ambitions. Was he a necessary strongman who brought stability and laid the groundwork for Athens' future greatness, or did he simply delay the development of true citizen self-rule? It's a complex legacy. He certainly seems to have understood the grievances of the poorer citizens better than many of his aristocratic peers, or at least, he was better at appearing to do so. Peisistratus rules until his death in 527 BCE, and he's succeeded by his sons, Hippias and Hipparchus. Initially, they continue their father's policies, and Athens remains relatively peaceful and prosperous. Hipparchus, in particular, is known as a patron of poets and artists. However, the vibe starts to change. A personal dispute leads to the assassination of Hipparchus in 514 BCE by two young men, Harmodius and Aristogiton. While their motives were likely personal revenge, they later became celebrated as tyrannicides and symbols of the fight against oppression, a bit of historical rebranding, you might say. After his brother's murder, Hippias becomes increasingly paranoid and oppressive. The benevolent tyranny starts to feel a lot less benevolent and a lot more, well, tyrannical. Arbitrary arrests, exiles, and a general atmosphere of fear begin to creep back into Athenian life, a rather unwelcome throwback to earlier times. This hardening of the tyranny under Hippias creates the conditions for its eventual overthrow. Disaffected nobles, with help from Sparta, who had their own reasons for disliking tyrants, especially ones friendly with their rival, Argos, eventually managed to expel Hippias in 510 BCE. The Peisistrated era is over. And as you stand there, amidst the newly liberated, but also rather uncertain, city, you can feel the political vacuum. The tyranny provided stability, yes, and even some progress. But it suppressed the political development that Solon had tentatively begun. Now, with the tyrant gone, the question is, what next? Will Athens revert to the chaotic factionalism of old? Or will someone, or something, push it in a new, even more radical direction? The legacy of Peisistratus is that he showed that the common people could be a powerful political force, and that their needs couldn't be ignored. But he also left Athens with a taste of one-man rule that many were now determined to avoid repeating. The stage is now set for another major reformer. One who will take Solon's ideas and Peisistratus's popular appeal and forge them into something genuinely revolutionary. So, Hippias, the not-so-benevolent son of Peisistratus, has finally been shown the exit. With a little help from some disgruntled Athenian nobles and a Spartan intervention force, always handy to have a regional superpower on speed dial when you want to evict a troublesome tyrant. You're standing in Athens around 510 BCE, and the city is buzzing. There's a sense of relief, definitely, like when a really long, boring meeting finally ends. But underneath that relief, there's a whole heap of uncertainty. The Peisistrated era, for all its eventual sourness under Hippias, had provided a certain stability for nearly 4 decades. Now, it's a free-for-all. The old aristocratic families, the Eupatridae we met way back, are probably dusting off their finest tunics and thinking, right, our turn again. The air is thick with scheming. with hushed conversations in shadowy porticos, and the faint, but distinct, smell of political ambition. It's like the starting gun has fired, but no one's quite sure what the race is, or where the finish line might be. Two main figures quickly emerge as frontrunners in this post-tyranny power grab. On one side, you have Athens, an aristocrat who fancies himself the natural leader to restore a more traditional, elite-controlled government. Think of him as the "make Athens Eupatrid again" candidate. On the other side is Cleisthenes, himself an aristocrat from the prominent Athenian family. You might remember his family had a long-running feud with Peisistratus and were instrumental in Hippias's overthrow. Cleisthenes is a canny operator, and he seems to realize that the old ways of doing things, the old power structures, aren't going to cut it anymore. The demos, the common people of Athens, had a taste of influence under Peisistratus, even if it was managed influence, and they weren't keen on just handing all the power back to a handful of wealthy families. Athens initially gets the upper hand, becoming archon in 508 BCE. He tries to roll back some of the changes and consolidate power for his oligarchic faction. He even attempts to dissolve the existing council and purge hundreds of families from the citizen rolls, targeting Cleisthenes and his supporters. As part of this charming initiative, he calls in his Spartan buddies again, led by King Cleisthenes. The Spartans, never ones to miss an opportunity to meddle in Athenian affairs, march into Athens and try to install Athens as a sort of puppet ruler. For a moment, it looks like Athens might just trade one kind of autocracy for another, or worse, become a Spartan satellite state. Athens even tried to use the old curse supposedly laid on Cleisthenes' Athenian family, something about sacrilege committed generations ago. These old families loved to hold a grudge, and a curse was the gift that kept on giving, as a way to discredit him. Imagine trying that in a modern political debate. My opponent is not only wrong on fiscal policy, but his great-great-great-grandfather offended Zeus. Checkmate. But then something remarkable happens. The ordinary citizens of Athens, the demos, who had been largely spectators in these high-level political games, decide they've had enough. They rise up. Not in a violent, head-chopping kind of revolution, but in a determined, widespread popular resistance. They besiege Athens and the Spartans on the Acropolis for 2 days. Cut off and clearly not welcome, Cleisthenes and Athens are forced to withdraw, tails somewhat between their legs. It's a powerful moment, the people themselves, taking direct action to shape their own destiny. This popular uprising is a clear signal that the political landscape has fundamentally changed. With Athens out of the picture, he kind of fades into ignominy after this. The ancient equivalent of being ratioed on social media, Cleisthenes returns to Athens in triumph, not as a conqueror, but as someone with a clear mandate from the people. And he doesn't just restore the old order. He unleashes a set of reforms so radical, so transformative, that they are widely considered the true birth of Athenian demokratia, people power. His central idea is to completely reorganize the very basis of Athenian citizenship and political life, to break the power of the old aristocratic clans and regional factions once and for all. The mainstream historical fact you need to grasp here is his abolition of the 4 old Ionian tribes, which were largely based on kinship and dominated by powerful families. In their place, Cleisthenes creates 10 brand new tribes, the Phylae. This isn't just a casual rebranding, like changing the team colors. This is a fundamental re-engineering of Athenian society. Here's the genius part: each of these 10 new tribes is designed to be a microcosm of Attica itself. He divides the whole of Attica, the city, Asti, the coast, Paralia, and the inland, Mesogea, into about 139 small local units called demes. Think of a deme as a village, a parish, or a local neighborhood. Your deme becomes your primary identifier. From now on, an Athenian citizen is known by his name and his deme, e.g., Pericles of Calargos. This is a huge shift. Your loyalty is now, first and foremost, to your local community and to the wider Athenian state, not to some ancient, possibly mythical, clan ancestor. Some of these demi-names were wonderfully prosaic, deriving from local features or even, some scholars jest, local industries, so you might have the equivalent of pigsty or donkey burrow, giving a real local flavor to citizenship. It's a bit like being identified by your postcode rather than your family tree on a national database. Then, to form the 10 tribes. Cleisthenes takes these demes and groups them into 30 larger units called trides, thirds. There are 10 trides from the city region, 10 from the coastal region, and 10 from the inland region. Each of the 10 new tribes is then composed of 3 trides, crucially, one from each of these 3 geographical regions. So, tribe number 1, they were actually named after mythical Athenian heroes, like Erechtheus, Aegeus, Pandiones, etc., giving them a sense of ancient legitimacy, would have some demes from the city, some from the coast, and some from the agricultural inland. This is a masterstroke of social engineering. It means that men from different parts of Attica, with potentially different economic interests and old loyalties, are now thrown together in the same tribe. They have to cooperate, to deliberate, to find common ground if their tribe is to function effectively in the political life of the city. It's like forcing Hatfields and McCoys from different regions to be on the same bowling team every week, for the good of the league. The aim is to dilute old aristocratic power bases that were often geographically concentrated and to foster a broader, pan-Athenian identity. Building on this new tribal structure, Cleisthenes reforms Solon's council. He creates the Council of 500, or the Bull. Each of the 10 tribes now provides 50 councillors each year, chosen by lot from male citizens over the age of 30 who put themselves forward. This use of the lot, sortition, is a defining feature of the new democratic system. The idea is that any eligible citizen is capable of public service, and selection by lot prevents corruption and the dominance of powerful individuals or factions. Imagine government positions being filled like jury duty, a civic responsibility for ordinary folk. This bull becomes the workhorse of the Athenian government, preparing the agenda for the assembly, ecclesia, which Solon had opened up to all citizens, managing finances, overseeing magistrates, and handling foreign affairs on a day-to-day basis. It's a massive step towards giving ordinary citizens direct control over the running of their city. Historians still argue whether Cleisthenes was a true democratic idealist, driven by a profound belief in the wisdom of the people, or a supremely pragmatic politician who used these reforms primarily to break the power of his aristocratic rivals, like Isagoras and his faction, and to secure the dominance of his own Alcmaeonid family. Was he responding to genuine popular demand from below, the kind that had just kicked the Spartans out, or was he cleverly co-opting that popular energy for his own ends? Perhaps it was a bit of both. Politics, even ancient politics, is rarely pure. He was an aristocrat, after all, and it's unlikely he wanted complete social leveling. But whatever his ultimate personal motives, the system he put in place had undeniably democratic effects, empowering the demos in ways that were unprecedented. You can imagine the buzz, the confusion, the excitement, and the grumbling as these reforms are rolled out. Old aristocrats are probably sputtering into their wine. What is this madness? Choosing important officials by lot. You might as well ask a goat for financial advice. Meanwhile, a farmer from a remote inland demi might find himself traveling to the city to serve on the bull, sitting alongside a merchant from the Piraeus harbor and an artisan from the city center, all part of the same tribe, all expected to work together. It must have been bewildering and exhilarating. The old social map of Athens is being completely redrawn. Cleisthenes' reforms didn't create a perfect democracy overnight, by modern standards. Women, slaves, and foreign residents, metics, were still excluded from political life. But for adult male citizens, The system offered a degree of direct participation in political equality that was revolutionary for its time. The word demokratia itself, combining demos, people, and kratos, power or rule, begins to more accurately describe the Athenian political system from this point onwards. It's a system where, in theory at least, the people hold sovereign power. You see new public notice boards, sonida, going up, perhaps displaying lists of citizens by their new demes and tribes, or the agendas for the assembly. There's a new rhythm to civic life, structured around the meetings of the demes, the tribes, the Council of 500, and the full assembly on the Pnyx hill. The reforms also included measures like strengthening the army by organizing it along tribal lines, with each tribe providing a regiment. This further integrated citizens into the new structures and fostered tribal solidarity in defense of the city. The air in Athens now feels different from the fearful quiet of Draco, the uneasy compromises of Solon, or the managed stability of Peisistratus. There's a new dynamic, a sense of collective ownership, and probably a healthy dose of chaos as everyone figures out how this newfangled demokratia is supposed to work. It's the start of a grand experiment, one that will see Athens rise to unprecedented heights of power and cultural achievement, but also face enormous challenges. Cleisthenes has effectively thrown open the doors of political power much wider than ever before. The question now is how the Athenians will use it. The dust is still settling from Cleisthenes' grand redesign of Athenian society. Those 10 new tribes are finding their feet, and the Council of 500 is busily trying to figure out how to manage the city's day-to-day affairs without accidentally voting to, say, declare war on a particularly aggressive flock of seagulls. You can feel the change in the air. It's less about which aristocratic family has the snazziest new chariot and more about, well, more about everyone else. Or at least, every eligible male citizen. Which, granted, still leaves out a fair chunk of the population, but it's a revolutionary step nonetheless. The center of political gravity has shifted, and you, as our ever-present, ever-sleepy observer, are about to witness where it has landed, on a rather unassuming hill southwest of the Acropolis called the Pnyx. This is where the ecclesia, the assembly of all Athenian citizens, gathers to do the business of demokratia. Imagine yourself walking towards the Pnyx on an assembly day. It's early morning, the Aegean sun already climbing. You're not alone, a stream of citizens is heading in the same direction. Farmers from the Attic countryside who perhaps walked for hours or even stayed overnight in the city. Fishermen and merchants from the Piraeus smelling faintly of the sea, artisans from the city workshops, and yes, even some of those Eupatridae, the well-fathered, who now have to rub shoulders with everyone else if they want their voices heard. It's a motley crew, a far cry from a stuffy, wood-paneled parliamentary chamber. There's a murmur of conversation, speculation about the day's agenda, perhaps some grumbling about having to leave work. It's like the ancient Greek version of a very, very large town hall meeting, but with the fate of an entire city-state hanging in the balance. And probably fewer PowerPoint presentations, which is a bonus. The Pnyx itself isn't initially some grand amphitheater. In these early days after Cleisthenes, it's more of a natural, gently sloping hillside. Later, they'll carve out a proper speaking platform, the bema, and create a more formal seating area. But for now, you find a spot on the bare rock or dusty ground, jostling for a decent position. The view is impressive, you can see the Acropolis, a constant reminder of the city's gods and its growing ambitions. The sheer number of people is astounding. In theory, all adult male citizens, probably over 18. Though some suggest 20, have the right to attend, potentially tens of thousands. In practice, the numbers vary. It's a bit of a trek for those living far out. And a day at the assembly means a day away from earning a living. For certain important votes, like those concerning citizenship or ostracism, which we'll get to, a quorum of 6,000 citizens was required, which tells you something about the scale they were aiming for. Imagine trying to get 6,000 people to agree on anything, let alone matters of state. It's a logistical challenge that would make modern event planners weep into their clipboards. As the crowd settles, there's an opening ritual, perhaps a sacrifice, a prayer to the gods for guidance. The herald then announces the agenda, which has been prepared by the Council of 500, the bull we met earlier. This agenda, the probuluma, sets out the matters for discussion. The bull has already thrashed out preliminary proposals, which is a sensible way to avoid the assembly just staring blankly at each other wondering what to talk about. Right lads, any thoughts on? Like, stuff, probably wouldn't be very efficient. Then comes the crucial moment. The herald proclaims, "'Tis anesti bolesthai." Who wishes to speak? This is isagoria. The equal right of every citizen to address the assembly. This is the beating heart of Athenian democracy. Any citizen, regardless of his wealth or social standing, within those new Cleisthenic tribes, of course, can, in theory, get up on that bema, or just a prominent rock. In these earlier days, and offer his opinion, propose an amendment, or argue for or against a course of action. It's a heady concept. You, a humble potter or a farmer who usually only debates the price of olives, could now address thousands of your fellow citizens on matters of war, peace, laws, or alliances. Of course, can speak and will be listened to are two different things. Oratory is a skill, and just like today, some people are better at it than others. You'll see seasoned politicians, men known for their persuasive rhetoric, perhaps some from the old noble families who've adapted to this new game, or new men rising through the ranks based on their ability to sway the crowd. But you'll also see ordinary citizens tentatively making their points. The atmosphere can be boisterous. There's no polite, here, here, here. Good speeches might be met with cheers and applause. Unpopular or boring ones might get heckling, shouting, or even laughter. It's direct, raw, and sometimes chaotic. Imagine a particularly rowdy online comments section, but in person. In the baking sun, and with actual consequences. It's democracy in the raw, folks. The powers of the ecclesia are immense. This is a key mainstream historical fact. The assembly is the sovereign body of Athens. It passes laws, nomoi, and decrees, psephismata. It decides on foreign policy, whether to go to war, make peace, or form alliances. It elects certain key officials, most notably the strategoi, the generals who will lead Athens in war. Interestingly, these were elected, not chosen by lot. Because you probably don't want your military strategy decided by pulling a name out of a hat. Congrats, Demetrios the goat herder, you're now in charge of the fleet. The assembly also audits the performance of magistrates at the end of their term and holds them accountable. It can grant citizenship, a highly prized status. Essentially, all major decisions about the life of the city-state pass through this vast, sometimes unruly, gathering. Now for a quirky tidbit, how do you make sure people actually turn up? Especially when their olive grove needs tending or their fishing nets mending? Later in Athenian history, particularly in the late 5th and 4th centuries BCE, a payment for assembly attendance was introduced, precisely to enable poorer citizens to participate without losing a day's wages. But even before that, and continuing alongside, there was a rather charmingly coercive method. The state employed a contingent of Scythian archers, basically, foreign mercenaries who acted as a kind of rudimentary police force. If citizens were dawdling in the agora, marketplace, instead of heading to the Pnyx, these archers would sometimes be deployed with a long rope dipped in wet red paint. They'd sweep through the agora. And anyone whose gleaming white tunic got a smear of red from the rope was marked as a slacker and might face a fine or at least public shaming. It's like the ancient Athenian version of a truancy officer, but with more paint and burly archers. Oi, you! Get to democracy, or face the crimson mark of civic irresponsibility. Historians still argue about the true dynamics of power within the ecclesia. How much genuine influence did the average, non-elite citizen really have? Were decisions truly the result of collective deliberation and the will of the people, or were they largely orchestrated by skilled orators? Charismatic leaders, who would later be termed demagogues, leaders of the people, but often with a negative connotation of manipulation, and powerful political factions working behind the scenes? Could a lone, eloquent farmer really change the course of Athenian policy, or was he just a voice in a carefully managed storm? The reality was likely complex, a mixture of genuine popular sentiment, persuasive leadership, and sometimes, mass emotion. It wasn't a perfect system, and it was certainly vulnerable to manipulation, as later critics like Plato would vehemently point out. You watch as a debate unfolds. Perhaps it's about whether to send ships to aid a distant ally, or how to fund a new temple. Speakers come and go. Some are passionate, some logical, some just loud. The crowd murmurs, shouts, waves their hands. Eventually, the time comes to vote. For most decisions, this is done by a simple show of hands, cheirotonia. The presiding officials, often members of the boule from the tribe whose turn it was to be in charge, the Prytaneus, would try to judge which side had the majority. If it was too close to call, they might divide the assembly or use a more precise method, like counting votes using colored pebbles. Imagine trying to count thousands of raised hands accurately under the glare of the Mediterranean sun. It's a system built on a certain amount of trust, and probably a fair bit of squinting. Being part of this, you feel the weight of responsibility, but also the exhilaration. Your vote, along with thousands of others, directly shapes the future. It's a far cry from the days when decisions were made behind closed doors by a select few eupatridae. This is messy, it's imperfect, it can be swayed by a good speech or a bad mood. But it is undeniably participatory. It's the sound of a city trying to govern itself, with all the accompanying noise, argument, and occasional brilliance. This is the engine room of Athenian democracy, and its roar, however chaotic, will echo through the ages. You might even get a bit of a sunburn while you're at it. A small price to pay for direct democracy. You've just experienced the exhilarating, slightly deafening roar of the ecclesia on the Pnyx hill. Thousands of your fellow citizens, a sea of voices and waving hands. Making decisions that could change the course of Athenian history, or at least decide where the new public fountain goes. It's heady stuff, this direct democracy. But you might be wondering. As you wipe the Pnyx dust, and possibly a bit of spittle from an over-enthusiastic orator, from your tunic, how does this massive, sometimes unruly, gathering actually get anything done efficiently? How does it avoid just evolving into a citywide shouting match about who left the gate open for the goats again? Well, that's where our next stop comes in, the boule, the Council of 500. If the ecclesia is the grand stage where the Athenian drama unfolds, the boule is the tireless, slightly stressed-out stage crew working diligently behind the scenes. Making sure the props are in place, the actors know their lines, metaphorically speaking, and the whole production doesn't collapse into chaos. Remember those 10 new tribes Cleisthenes cooked up? Mixing citizens from the city, coast, and inland? Each of those tribes selects 50 men, chosen by lot each year from citizens aged 30 or over, to serve as counselors. So, you have this body of 500 ordinary Athenians, farmers, merchants, artisans, maybe even the occasional philosopher who drew the short straw, or rather, the lucky beam. These aren't professional politicians in the modern sense, they're citizens doing their civic duty for a year. They meet in a special building near the agora called the Bouleuterion. The council house. Imagine it as less of an open-air rock concert like the Pnyx, and more of a very large, very serious committee meeting. Though probably with better snacks than your average office get-together, honey cakes, anyone? The boule's most crucial function. And this is a mainstream historical fact you'll want to jot down in your mental notebook, is preparing the agenda for the ecclesia. This is called probouleusis. Before any proposal can be put to the assembly, the bull discusses it, debates it, and formulates a preliminary decree, a probuluma. This might be a specific recommendation. The council recommends we build 10 new triremes and paint them a fetching shade of crimson, or it might present options for the assembly to consider. Shoal. Do we ally with Argos, Corinth, or just buy everyone a nice olive branch and hope for the best? This agenda-setting power is immense. It means the bull guides and focuses the deliberations of the much larger assembly, preventing it from getting bogged down in an endless sea of random suggestions. It's like the difference between a brainstorming session with a clear objective and one where everyone just shouts out words that rhyme with orange. Now, to manage this daily grind of governance. The year is divided into 10 periods, and each tribe's contingent of 50 counselors takes turns being the Prytaneus, or standing committee, for one of these periods, roughly 35 to 36 days. These 50 guys are basically on duty 24/7. And here's a really quirky tidbit. The Prytaneus lived and dined at public expense in a special round building near the Bouleuterion called the Tholos. Think of it as a sort of combination dorm room, canteen, and emergency operations center for the government. At least a third of them had to be present in the Tholos at all times, day and night. So, if a messenger arrived with urgent news in the middle of the night, the Spartans are looking shifty again. There was always a core group of officials ready to deal with it. It's like being a resident advisor in a particularly important university, but with the fate of the city resting on your ability to stay awake after a large public-funded dinner. And it gets even more specific. Each day, one member of the 50 Prytaneus on duty was chosen by lot to be the chairman, the epistats. For that single 24-hour period. This randomly selected citizen held the keys to the state treasury, the public archives, and the state seal. He presided over meetings of the bull and, if an assembly was called, he'd preside over that too. Talk about a whirlwind tour of executive power. One day you're Pericles Papadopoulos, humble olive farmer, the next you're effectively the president of Athens for a day. And the day after, you're back to worrying about olive flies. This rapid rotation of ultimate daily authority is a fascinating democratic safeguard, designed to prevent any one individual from accumulating too much power for too long. It's like being king for a day, but the crown is made of paperwork and responsibility. But the bull did much more than just prepare assembly agendas and pick a daily leader. They were the administrative backbone of Athens. They managed public finances, overseeing the collection of revenues, which didn't involve an overly complex income tax system back then, relying more on things like port duties, fines, and contributions from the wealthy, and authorizing expenditures. They supervised public contracts for everything from building temples to maintaining roads. If a new bridge was needed, the bull would likely be involved in approving the plans and the budget. It's not all glamorous speeches and declarations of war, a lot of it is the nitty-gritty of keeping a city running. The kind of stuff that makes modern city councils tear their hair out. They also had a significant role in foreign affairs, while the ecclesia made the big decisions on war and alliances. The bull would often receive foreign ambassadors first, hear their proposals, and formulate a recommendation for the assembly. Imagine being a counselor when envoys from a powerful Persian satrap or a nervous Spartan king arrive. You'd need to be diplomatic, shrewd, and very good at not spilling wine on important treaties. They also oversaw the navy, ensuring ships were seaworthy and properly equipped, a vital task for a growing maritime power like Athens. They'd scrutinize magistrates before they entered office, dokimasia, and examine their conduct at the end of their term, euthanae, ensuring accountability. It's like an internal affairs department, a treasury, a foreign office, and a public works committee all rolled into one, and all staffed by citizens chosen by lot. No wonder they needed that 24/7 canteen in the Tholos. Historians still argue about the precise balance of power between the bull and the ecclesia. Was the bull truly just a servant of the assembly? diligently preparing business and carrying out its instructions? Or did its crucial agenda-setting role, its control over information flow, and its daily administrative authority give it a more profound, perhaps even subtly controlling, influence on Athenian policy? Could a determined bull effectively stifle proposals it disliked or push its own agenda through the ecclesia? It's likely the relationship was dynamic, shifting with the political climate and the personalities involved. Sometimes the assembly would chafe at the bull's proposals and take matters in a completely different direction, other times it would readily accept the council's guidance. It was a partnership, sometimes harmonious, sometimes a bit tetchy, like any good long-term collaboration. You can imagine the scene inside the Bouleuterion. It's quieter than the Pnyx, more focused. Counselors are seated, perhaps grouped by tribe. There are discussions, debates, but likely with more procedural formality than the free-for-all of the assembly. Scribes are busy taking notes on papyrus or wax tablets. Messengers come and go. There's a sense of constant, purposeful activity. These 500 citizens, in their year of service, are learning the intricacies of governance, gaining first-hand experience in everything from financial oversight to diplomatic protocol. And when their term is up, they return to private life, replaced by another 500. Taking that knowledge and experience back into the wider citizen body. This constant cycling of citizens through positions of real administrative responsibility is one of the most remarkable aspects of the Athenian democratic experiment. It's a massive investment in civic education, on-the-job training for democracy. The bull, therefore, wasn't just a talking shop or a rubber stamp. It was the engine room of Athenian democracy. The place where the broad policy decisions of the ecclesia were translated into concrete actions, and where the daily business of a complex, burgeoning city-state was managed by its own citizens. It ensured that when the assembly roared, it had something coherent to roar about, and that after the roaring was done, someone was there to make sure the decisions were actually implemented. It's perhaps less glamorous than facing down a Persian fleet, but just as vital for the survival and success of Athens. You've seen the Athenian democracy in full swing, from the boisterous, decision-making roar of the ecclesia on the Pnyx hill, to the diligent, behind-the-scenes administrative hum of the bull in its council house. Laws are being made, decrees are being passed, and the city is, more or less, being steered by its citizens. But what happens when someone breaks those laws? What happens when neighbor argues with neighbor over a runaway donkey or a disputed inheritance, or when a politician is accused of something shady? You can't just have a quick show of hands on the Pnyx for every single legal dispute. That would be, even for the Athenians, a bit much. No, for justice, Athens had another remarkable institution, equally infused with the spirit of demokratia, the dikasteria, the people's law courts. So, grab your juror's ticket, figuratively speaking, because you're about to get a front-row seat to Athenian justice in action. Forget everything you know about modern courtrooms with bewigged judges, sharp-suited lawyers objecting furiously, and complex rules of evidence. Athenian courts were a different beast altogether. The most striking thing, and a core mainstream historical fact, was the sheer size of the juries, or dikastai. We're not talking 12 good men and true here. Athenian juries were massive, typically 201, 501, sometimes even 1001, 1501, or more citizens, depending on the importance of the case. Each year, a pool of 6,000 male citizens over the age of 30 would be selected by lot from those who volunteered. From this pool, on any given day the courts were in session. Jurors would be assigned by lot to specific cases. Why so many? Well, a primary reason was to prevent bribery and intimidation. It's a lot harder, and more expensive, to bribe or lean on a few hundred jurors than a dozen. It's like trying to secretly buy dinner for an entire small town just to win a raffle. And who were these jurors? They were ordinary Athenian citizens, your local baker, the farmer from down the road, the sandal maker, the fisherman. Just like the members of the boule. They weren't legal experts. They were expected to listen to the arguments and use their common sense and understanding of Athenian law and custom to reach a verdict. To enable even poorer citizens to participate without suffering financial hardship, a day in court meant a day away from work. After all, Pericles, in the mid-5th century BCE, introduced payment for jury service. It wasn't a fortune, perhaps enough to buy a modest day's food. But it was a crucial step in ensuring that the juries reflected a broad cross-section of the citizenry, not just those wealthy enough to have a day off. So, imagine it's your lucky day. Your name has been drawn from the allotment machine, a rather ingenious stone device called a clariterion that used black and white balls to randomly assign jurors to courts. The Athenians loved they. Are lotteries for almost everything. You make your way to the designated courthouse, perhaps one of the several located around the agora. You take your seat on a wooden bench alongside hundreds of your fellow dicasti. There's no imposing judge on a high bench. There are presiding magistrates. But their role is largely administrative, to ensure the proceedings run smoothly and according to law. Not to instruct the jury on points of law or to make rulings on evidence in the way a modern judge does. You, the juror, are both judge and jury. You decide on matters of fact, on the interpretation of the law, and, if the defendant is found guilty, often on the penalty as well. Talk about responsibility. The litigants, the plaintiff and the defendant, generally have to plead their own cases. There are no professional lawyers in our sense. You couldn't just hire a legal eagle to argue for you. However, a thriving industry of logographers, speechwriters, emerged. If you weren't a confident public speaker, or if your legal arguments were a bit wobbly, you could pay a skilled logographer to write a powerful and persuasive speech for you, which he would then memorize and deliver as if it were your own. It's like getting a really good speechwriter for your best man speech, but with potentially much higher stakes than just embarrassing the groom. Now for a truly fascinating and quirky detail. The timing of these speeches. To ensure fairness, each litigant was given an equal amount of time to present their case. And how did they measure this time? With a clepsydra, a water clock. This was essentially a container filled with water that would empty through a small hole at a consistent rate. When your water ran out, your time was up. Whether you were in mid-sentence or just getting to your really good bit. Imagine a modern courtroom drama where the lawyer is suddenly cut off mid-summation by a large, glug, glug, glug from the corner. But your honors, I was just about to reveal the surprise witness. Sorry, Demosthenes, your water's out. Next case. This strict timekeeping forced speakers to be concise and to the point, or at least to talk very, very fast. You listen as the plaintiff presents his case. He might call witnesses, who would swear oaths. Evidence, such as documents or physical objects, might be presented. Then the defendant gets his turn, also timed by the relentless drip of the clepsydra. Speeches could be emotional, filled with appeals to pity, attacks on the opponent's character, reminders of one's own service to the state, or dramatic displays of weeping family members. Remember, you're not just convincing a single judge, you're trying to sway a crowd of hundreds of your peers, who bring all their own experiences, prejudices, and understanding of human nature to the courtroom. It's a very human, and sometimes very theatrical, process. Once all the arguments have been heard, it's time for the dicasti to vote. There's no lengthy deliberation in a secluded jury room. Each juror makes up their own mind. Voting was done by secret ballot, typically using small bronze discs or pebbles. Each juror would be given 2 discs. One with a solid axle and one with a hollow axle, or sometimes marked in other ways. One represented conviction, the other acquittal. You would approach a set of urns and deposit the disc representing your vote into one urn, the valid urn, and the unused disc into another, the discard urn. concealing the type of disc you were casting until the last moment to maintain secrecy. The officials would then count the discs. A simple majority decided the verdict. If the vote was tied, the defendant was usually acquitted, the ancient equivalent of benefit of the doubt. The range of cases heard by these popular courts was enormous. They dealt with everything from private disputes, inheritance claims, breaches of contract, arguments over property boundaries, you can bet olive groves featured heavily, to public cases, including charges of theft, assault, impiety, and even murder, though murder cases often went before the Areopagus, especially in earlier times. Crucially, the dicasteria also played a major political role. Citizens could bring a graphparanamon, an indictment against someone for proposing a law or decree that was deemed unconstitutional or contrary to the interests of Athens. This meant that the courts could effectively review and even overturn decisions made by the ecclesia or actions taken by officials. It was a powerful democratic check, ensuring that even the will of the assembly was subject to the rule of law, as interpreted by the citizen jurors. It's like having a Supreme Court, but staffed by 501 of your neighbors chosen at random. Historians still argue about the fairness and effectiveness of the Athenian dicasteria. Were these massive citizen juries, without professional judges or clear rules of evidence, capable of delivering consistent and impartial justice? Or were they too easily swayed by rhetoric, emotional appeals, popular prejudice, or political considerations, especially in high-profile trials? The trial and condemnation of Socrates in 399 BCE, for instance, often cited as a dark moment for Athenian democracy, was carried out by a dicasterion. Did such courts truly uphold the rule of law, or did they sometimes become instruments of political factions or mass hysteria? It's a complex question, and the answer probably lies somewhere in between. For every questionable verdict, there were likely countless everyday disputes settled in a way that the community found acceptable. As you cast your voting disc, you feel the weight of the decision. You've listened intently, you've tried to discern truth from rhetoric, justice from personal vendetta. You are one of hundreds. Yet your individual judgment matters. This system, for all its potential flaws and its sometimes chaotic nature, placed immense trust in the ordinary citizen. It assumed that a collective of common sense, guided by the laws and a desire for fairness, could arrive at just outcomes. It was another pillar of the Athenian democratic edifice, ensuring that the power of the law, like the power of governance, ultimately rested with the demos. As you leave the courthouse, the sun setting over the agora, you reflect on a system where any citizen could be called upon not just to make the laws, or administer the city, but to sit in judgment of their peers. It's a truly profound expression of citizen power, and one that would leave an indelible mark on the concept of justice for centuries to come. You've seen how Athenians dispense justice in their massive citizen courts, the dicasteria, where hundreds of your peers weigh evidence, and eloquent speeches, to decide guilt or innocence. It's a system designed to ensure laws are upheld and disputes are settled by the people themselves. But the Athenians, having experienced the harshness of Draco, the near civil war before Solon, and the rise and fall of the Peisistratus tyranny, were understandably a bit twitchy about anyone getting too powerful, too influential, too big for their sandals. They knew that ambition, left unchecked, could easily topple their hard-won demokratia. So, they devised a rather unique and frankly bizarre political tool to deal with this perceived threat. A sort of preemptive strike against potential tyrants or overwhelmingly dominant politicians. Get ready to learn about ostracism. Now, ostracism wasn't a trial for a crime. You weren't accused of anything specific, there were no lawyers, no witnesses, no defense speeches timed by a gurgling water clock. Being ostracized didn't mean you lost your citizenship. Your property wasn't confiscated, and your family wasn't punished. It was, essentially, a political cooling-off period. If the Athenian demos decided you were becoming a bit too much of a political heavyweight, a potential threat to the balance of their democracy, they could vote to send you on a 10-year. All expenses paid, by yourself, mind you, vacation away from Athens. Think of it as the ultimate political timeout, or perhaps an involuntary gap year. Congratulations, Themistocles. You've won a decade-long sabbatical. Don't call us, we'll call you, in 10 years. Here's how this peculiar process worked. And it's a fascinating mainstream historical fact about Athenian democracy. Once a year, the ecclesia, that grand assembly on the Pnyx, would first decide if they even wanted to hold an ostracism that year. There had to be a specific vote to activate the procedure. If the vote was, yes, let's potentially kick someone out, then a special day was set aside, usually a couple of months later. On that day, citizens wouldn't gather on the Pnyx, but in a specially cordoned-off section of the agora. No speeches, no debates. Just voting. And what did they vote with? Not raised hands or fancy bronze discs. They voted with ostraca, simple potsherds, broken pieces of pottery. Pottery was cheap and plentiful, so everyone could get their hands on a piece to use as a makeshift ballot. You'd scratch or write the name of the individual you thought most deserved a 10-year break from Athenian politics onto your ostracan. Imagine the scene, thousands of citizens queuing up, each clutching their ostracan. There's a tense, almost furtive atmosphere. You write down your chosen name, maybe it's a powerful general you think is getting a bit too popular, or a smooth-talking politician whose influence you distrust, or maybe it's just that annoying guy from the next demi who always hogs the best olives at the market, though hopefully civic duty outweighed petty grievances, usually. Officials would collect these ostraca. For the ostracism to be valid, a quorum of at least 6,000 total votes had to be cast. If that number was reached, the ostraca were sorted, and the names were counted. The individual whose name appeared on the most potsherds was then formally declared ostracized. They had 10 days to pack their bags and leave Attica for a decade. After 10 years, they could return and, in theory, resume their civic life as if nothing had happened. Though one imagines dinner parties might have been a tad awkward initially. So, Aristides, how was your extended trip abroad? Now for a quirky tidbit that adds a layer of intrigue to this already strange procedure. Archaeologists have unearthed large caches of ostraca, and some of them are quite revealing. For instance, a batch of 190 ostraca was found at the bottom of a well, all bearing the name of Themistocles, the hero of the Battle of Salamis, and apparently written by only a handful of different hands. This suggests that political factions might have prepared these ballots in advance, distributing them to their supporters. It hints at organized campaigning. A sort of ancient get-out-the-vote against this guy effort. It's like finding stacks of pre-filled ballot papers, makes you wonder how much of this was spontaneous popular sentiment versus a well-orchestrated political hit job. One famous story, possibly apocryphal but wonderfully illustrative, tells of Aristides, the Just. An illiterate farmer supposedly approached Aristides, not knowing who he was, and asked him to write Aristides on his ostracan. When Aristides asked if this Aristides had done him any wrong, the farmer replied, "No, and I don't even know him, but I am tired of hearing him everywhere called the Just. If true, Aristides was apparently so virtuous it annoyed people into exiling him. Talk about a backhanded compliment. Famous names who felt the sharp edge of ostracism include some of Athens' most prominent figures, Xanthippus, Pericles' father, the aforementioned Aristides, the Just, and even Themistocles, the naval genius who masterminded the victory over the Persians at Salamis. It shows that no one, however popular or heroic, was immune if the demos perceived them as a threat. It was a powerful weapon, and like any weapon, it could be used for good or for ill. Historians still argue whether ostracism was a genuinely effective democratic safeguard that successfully prevented the rise of tyrants and helped manage intense political rivalries without resorting to bloodshed. or if it was a rather blunt and often unfair instrument that allowed the majority, or well-organized factions, to remove talented and experienced individuals from public life based on envy, fear, or political maneuvering. Did it contribute to political stability by providing a safety valve for tension, or did it lead to a tall poppy syndrome, cutting down anyone who rose too high, thereby depriving Athens of strong leadership when it might have been needed? It's a debate with no easy answers. The fact that it fell into disuse suggests that Athenians themselves eventually found it problematic. The last known ostracism, that of a rather less distinguished politician named Hyperbolus around 417 BCE, was apparently engineered by two rival political leaders, Alcibiades and Nicias, who temporarily joined forces to get rid of him. This was seen by many as a manipulation and debasement of the process, making ostracism seem less like a solemn civic duty and more like a dirty political trick. After that, it seems the Athenians lost their taste for it. You can imagine the tension in the agora on ostracism day. It wasn't a festival, nor was it a somber trial. It was something uniquely Athenian, a collective political act. A city deciding if one of its own had become too prominent for the city's good. There's a certain cold brutality to it, despite the lack of physical violence. The idea of your fellow citizens, people you fought alongside, debated with in the assembly, shared wine with at festivals, collectively deciding you need to be banished for a decade, that's a heavy thought. It must have been a powerful deterrent against overly overt displays of ambition. It encouraged politicians to walk a fine line, to be successful and influential, but not too successful. Not too influential, lest they find their name scratched on a few too many potsherds. It's like a citywide performance review where the ultimate sanction is, you're so good, you're fired. For 10 years. Ostracism highlights the Athenians' deep-seated fear of tyranny and their radical commitment to political equality, or at least to preventing gross inequality of political power. It was a uniquely democratic solution, placing the decision of who was too dangerous not in the hands of a king or a council of nobles, but in the hands of the entire citizen body. It's a far cry from a modern impeachment process or a vote of no confidence. It was more personal, more direct, and based on perception and potential rather than proven wrongdoing. As you watch the officials count the ostraca, the fate of one prominent Athenian hanging in the balance, you realize just how seriously this city took the idea of people power, and the extraordinary lengths they would go to protect it, even if it meant occasionally exiling their best and brightest. You've witnessed some pretty unique Athenian political engineering, haven't you? From the people's courts where hundreds of your fellow citizens deliver justice, to the rather dramatic annual possibility of someone being voted off the island, so to speak, with an ostracan. These mechanisms, born from a deep desire to protect their demokratia, shaped the political landscape. The dust from those ostracism votes has settled for a bit, and Athens is stepping into what many historians, with a flourish of romanticism, call its golden age. And if there's one name inextricably linked with this glittering era, it's Pericles. So, let's take a stroll, you and I, through the bustling, brilliant, and perhaps slightly self-satisfied streets of Athens in the mid-5th century BCE, under the long shadow, or rather, the radiant glow, of its leading citizen. Pericles isn't a king. Nor is he a tyrant in the old Peisistratus sense. He holds no single office that grants him supreme authority. Yet, for about 30 years, from roughly 461 to 429 BCE, he is undeniably the most influential figure in Athens. His power base? The ecclesia. He is elected strategos, one of 10 generals, year after year. But his real sway comes from his intellect. His unshakable integrity, at least as portrayed by his admirer, the historian Thucydides, his powerful oratory that could captivate and persuade that often rowdy assembly, and his clear vision for Athens. This long period of Pericles' political dominance and his consistent re-election as strategos is a key mainstream historical fact of this era. He was To put it in modern terms, the guy who could always win the big game, the captain everyone trusted to steer the ship, even if some grumbled about his style. As you wander through Athens now, the city is literally being transformed. Pericles initiates an ambitious building program that will forever define our image of classical Greece. The jewel in the crown, of course, is the Acropolis. That rocky outcrop, once a Mycenaean fortress and later adorned with earlier temples, is now the site of one of the most ambitious and breathtaking construction projects the ancient world had ever seen. The Parthenon. A magnificent temple dedicated to Athena Parthenos, Athena the Maiden, rises in gleaming Pentelic marble, a testament to Athenian wealth, power, and piety. Imagine the sheer scale of the operation. The quarrying and transport of massive marble blocks, the armies of skilled stonemasons, sculptors, and laborers, all working under the artistic direction of the genius sculptor Phidias, a close friend of Pericles. It's like a divinely inspired, publicly funded, mega-construction project that actually results in something beautiful, rather than just more traffic cones and delays. And it's not just the Parthenon. There's the Propylaea, the grand monumental gateway to the Acropolis, the Erechtheion. With its iconic caryatid porch, those lovely sculpted maidens holding up the roof, who probably needed a good chiropractor after a few centuries. These buildings aren't just pretty. They are statements. They shout to the Greek world, and to posterity, we are Athens. We are powerful, we are sophisticated, we are blessed by the gods, and boy, do we know how to spend our, ahem. Mostly other people's, money. Because let's be clear, this architectural grandeur is largely funded by the treasury of the Delian League. This league, initially formed as a voluntary alliance of Greek states to continue the war against Persia, has, by Pericles' time, effectively transformed into an Athenian empire. Member states pay tribute to Athens, and while some of that money goes towards maintaining the fleet that protects them, a hefty chunk is being diverted to adorn Athens itself. This imperial wealth is the not-so-secret ingredient in Athens' golden recipe. Now for a quirky tidbit about our leading man, Pericles. For all his dignity and, Olympian, calm, a nickname he earned for his detached, authoritative speaking style, though some said it was because his head, like Zeus's, was full of thunderous thoughts. He was also the subject of considerable ribbing from comic poets. They apparently loved to poke fun at the shape of his head, which was said to be unusually elongated. They called him Squill Head or Onion Head, a squill being a sea onion. This is why you'll often see statues and busts of Pericles wearing a helmet, even in non-military contexts. Historians cheekily suggest it might have been a clever way to conceal his rather distinctive cranial protuberance. So, the next time you see a dignified bust of Pericles in his Corinthian helmet, just imagine a mischievous comic poet in the background muttering about vegetables. It certainly makes him a bit more human, doesn't it? The intellectual and artistic life of Periclean Athens is dazzling. You can almost feel the buzz of creative energy in the air. This is the age of the great tragic playwrights. Sophocles and Euripides are staging their masterpieces in the theater of Dionysus, grappling with profound questions of fate, justice, and the human condition before audiences of thousands. Herodotus, the father of history, is in town, perhaps reciting parts of his histories. Thucydides, a younger contemporary, is keenly observing the political and military events that he will later chronicle with such penetrating insight. Philosophers like Anaxagoras, another friend of Pericles, who scandalized some by suggesting the sun was a molten rock and not a god, and the young Socrates are wandering the agora, engaging citizens in searching dialogues, questioning everything. Athens, as Pericles himself famously boasts in his funeral oration, as recorded by Thucydides, has become the school of Hellas, Greece. It's like living in a city that's a cross between a university campus, an arts festival, and a political convention, all rolled into one, and everyone's invited to the lectures, well, every male citizen, anyway. Democracy itself is deepened under Pericles. He champions policies that increase the participation of ordinary citizens. We've already mentioned the payment for jury service, which he likely introduced or solidified. It's believed he also extended pay to those serving on the bull and for other public offices filled by lot. Later, payment for attendance at the ecclesia would also be introduced. These measures were crucial. They ensured that poverty was not a barrier to full participation in the democratic life of the city. It meant that a poor farmer or artisan could afford to take time off to serve on a jury or in the council without his family starving. This is a radical idea, that civic duty should be compensated. Making democracy accessible not just in theory, but in practice. It's a far cry from systems where only the wealthy can afford to do politics. However, this golden glow has its shadows. The source of much of Athens' wealth and power, the Delian League, is a growing point of contention. What started as a voluntary alliance is increasingly an empire ruled by Athens with an iron fist. Allies who try to revolt or refuse to pay tribute are brutally suppressed. Pericles himself is an unapologetic imperialist in this regard. Believing that Athens' power is essential for its security and prosperity, and for the good of Greece, as defined by Athens, naturally. This creates simmering resentment among other Greek city-states, particularly the oligarchic, land-based power of Sparta, Athens' great rival. You can feel the tension building. Like the static electricity before a thunderstorm. The Peloponnesian War, the devastating conflict that will eventually engulf the Greek world and bring an end to this golden age, is looming on the horizon. It's like enjoying a spectacular party, knowing the grumpy neighbors are about to call the cops and shut the whole thing down. Historians still argue whether Athens under Pericles was truly the democratic ideal it's often portrayed as, or if, as Thucydides himself hints, it was, in name, a democracy, but in fact ruled by the first citizen. Pericles' influence was so profound and so long-lasting that some question whether the assembly was genuinely making independent decisions or merely ratifying his proposals. Did his dominance, however enlightened, subtly undermine the very democratic principles he espoused by creating a dependency on his leadership? Furthermore, there's the ongoing debate about the relationship between Athenian democracy and its empire. To what extent was the flourishing of democratic culture at home predicated on the subjugation of other Greeks abroad? How did Athenians reconcile their ideals of freedom and self-governance with their often ruthless imperial policies? These are uncomfortable questions that complicate the glittering image of the Golden Age. But for now, as you walk these vibrant streets, you see a city confident, dynamic, and breathtakingly beautiful. You might see stonemasons carefully carving the frieze on the Parthenon, their muscles gleaming with sweat under the Attic sun. You might overhear a group of citizens in the agora passionately discussing a recent play by Euripides or the latest political maneuverings in the assembly. You might even catch a glimpse of Pericles himself, walking with that famously calm demeanor. Perhaps with his intelligent and controversial partner Aspasia of Miletus by his side, a highly educated foreign woman who hosted intellectual salons and was said to advise Pericles, much to the consternation of some traditional Athenians. This is Athens at its zenith, a city that believes it has found the perfect balance of freedom, order, beauty, and power. It's a heady, intoxicating atmosphere. But the very forces that have propelled it to this height, its assertive democracy, its expansive ambition, its cultural self-confidence, are also generating the friction that will lead to its greatest trial. The gold of this age is brilliant, but it's also, perhaps, a little too bright, casting long, ominous shadows into the future. You've been basking in the reflected glory of Periclean Athens, haven't you? Marveling at the Parthenon as it scrapes the impossibly blue Attic sky. Listening to the intellectual fireworks in the agora, and imagining yourself part of that vibrant, confident democracy. It all seems rather wonderful. This golden age, where the people hold the power and art and philosophy flourish like well-watered olive trees. But as you wander these bustling streets, Past the gleaming temples and through the crowded marketplaces, you might start to notice that this grand, people power, this demokratia, is a bit like a very exclusive club. There are a lot of people in Athens, a whole bustling metropolis, but not everyone gets a membership card. In fact, most don't. So, let's pull back the curtain a little. Peek behind the democratic facade, and ask that crucial question, who's in, and, perhaps more importantly, who's out? The beating heart of Athenian democracy, the citizen, the polites, was a rather narrowly defined individual. To be a citizen in Periclean Athens, to have the right to vote in the ecclesia, serve on those massive juries in the dicasteria, be chosen by lot for the boule, or stand for election as a strategos, you had to be male, adult, generally over 18, sometimes 20 for full rights, and, crucially, of Athenian descent. And this definition of Athenian descent became even stricter right in the middle of this supposed golden age. Around 451/450 BCE. Pericles himself proposed and passed a law that sent ripples through Athenian society. This law stipulated that citizenship would henceforth only be granted to children whose both parents were Athenians. This is a major mainstream historical fact, and it had significant consequences. Before this, it seems having an Athenian father might have been enough in many cases. Now, the door to citizenship was narrowed considerably. Suddenly, if your dad was a true blue Athenian but your mum hailed from Corinth or Miletus, sorry, kid, no citizen badge for you. You're not quite one of us. It's like an exclusive club suddenly doubling its membership criteria just as it's becoming the most popular club in town. So, let's talk about the outs. First up, women. Athenian women. Whether they were the daughters and wives of the most prominent citizens or from more humble backgrounds, were entirely excluded from political life. They couldn't vote. They couldn't attend the assembly. Imagine the Pnyx if it was half empty, or rather, half full of people who actually knew where they'd left the household accounts. They couldn't hold public office. And they couldn't serve on juries. Their domain was primarily the oikos, the household, managing the home, raising the children, and overseeing the domestic slaves. Their public appearances were generally limited, often to religious festivals or family occasions. While they could inherit property and play a role in its transfer, often to their sons or through marriage dowries, their legal and economic autonomy was restricted. It's a stark reminder that this celebrated Athenian government by the people really meant government by about 10 to 20% of the total population, once you exclude women, children, slaves, and foreigners. It's like a company claiming to have a great employee participation scheme, but only for the chaps in the sales department. However, it's not entirely accurate to say women had no public role. And here's a quirky tidbit for you. Athenian women played a vital and very visible part in the religious life of the city. Certain priesthoods, often very ancient and prestigious, were held by women. They were central figures in many important festivals, like the Thesmophoria, a major fertility festival exclusively for women, dedicated to Demeter and Persephone, where they engaged in secret rituals, no men allowed. Which probably drove the more curious ones mad with speculation. Or the Panathenea, where young women had the honor of weaving the sacred peplos, robe, for the cult statue of Athena. So, while excluded from the political sphere, their role in the religious and cultural fabric of Athens was significant and respected. It's a complex picture, politically voiceless, yet ritually essential. Next on the out list, slaves. Slavery was a pervasive feature of ancient Athens, as it was across the ancient world. A substantial portion of the population of Attica consisted of enslaved people. They were considered property, with few, if any, legal rights. They worked in homes as domestic servants, in fields as agricultural laborers, in workshops as artisans, and, perhaps most grimly, in the silver mines at Laurion, toiling in horrific conditions to extract the wealth that helped fund Athens' fleet and its grand building projects. The life of a slave could vary enormously. From relatively benign domestic service to brutal exploitation. While manumission, the freeing of a slave, was possible, it didn't automatically grant citizenship. A freed slave typically became a metic, which we'll get to in a moment. The reliance on slave labor is an uncomfortable truth that underpins much of the Athenian achievement. It meant that citizens, particularly those of some means, had the leisure to participate in politics, philosophy, and the arts. It's easier to spend your day at the ecclesia or contemplating the nature of the good if someone else is doing all your chores and mining your silver. Then there are the metics, or metoikoi. These were free foreign residents, people from other Greek city-states or even non-Greek lands who chose to live and work in Athens. And there were many of them. Drawn by Athens' economic opportunities and vibrant cultural life. Metics were crucial to the Athenian economy. They were often skilled craftsmen, merchants, bankers, traders, and intellectuals. Aspasia, Pericles' influential partner, was a metic from Miletus. However, despite their contributions, metics could not become citizens, except in very rare cases by special grant of the assembly. They couldn't vote or hold office. They were generally not allowed to own land in Attica. They had to pay a special poll tax called the metoikion. And they were required to have an Athenian citizen as a sponsor or legal guardian, a prostates. They had legal rights and access to the courts, though perhaps not on an entirely equal footing with citizens, and they were expected to serve in the military alongside citizens. They were integrated into Athenian life in many ways, yet always remained a distinct, non-citizen group. Think of them as permanent residents with many civic duties but without the full package of civic rights. They could contribute to the party, even bring some of the best snacks. But they couldn't vote on the music. So, why this exclusivity, especially that tightening of the rules under Pericles with the 451/450 BCE citizenship law? Historians still argue whether this was driven by a desire to preserve the economic benefits of citizenship, like access to public pay and land, for a smaller, more privileged group. Or if it reflected a growing sense of Athenian chauvinism and a desire to define Athenian identity more narrowly in an age of empire. Perhaps it was a way to ensure the purity of the citizen body. Or maybe it was a pragmatic response to the increasing costs of running a participatory democracy. Fewer citizens meant less strain on the treasury that paid for jury service and council membership. It could also have been linked to land ownership and inheritance, ensuring that Attic land, the traditional basis of citizenship, remained in the hands of true Athenians. Whatever the primary motivations, the effect was clear: Athenian democracy, for all its radical inclusivity among the citizen body, was fundamentally exclusive in its definition of who that citizen body comprised. This exclusivity undoubtedly shaped the nature of Athenian democracy. On the one hand, it may have fostered a strong sense of cohesion, solidarity, and shared identity among the citizen elite. They were a privileged group, bound together by their shared rights and responsibilities. And their collective rule over a vast empire and a large non-citizen population. On the other hand, it created inherent inequalities and tensions. The reliance on slave labor, the exclusion of women from public life, and the second-class status of metics all stand in stark contrast to the democratic ideals of equality and participation proclaimed for the citizen body. It was a democracy for some, not for all residents of Attica. As you observe this complex society, you see citizens debating high policy in the assembly, while nearby, a metic merchant unloads goods at the Piraeus, a slave toils in a workshop, and a woman manages her household. All are part of Athens, all contribute to its functioning. But their relationship to its celebrated democracy is vastly different. Understanding these distinctions, these lines of inclusion and exclusion, is crucial to understanding the reality and the limitations of Athenian democracy in its golden age. It wasn't just about who got to speak on the Pnyx, but also about who built the Pnyx, who supplied the goods that kept the speakers fed. and who was entirely absent from its deliberations. The shining marble of the Parthenon looks a little different when you consider the full spectrum of the society that built it. You've had a good look at the membership list for Club Athens, noting who gets the full voting rights, who's in the associate tier, hello, medics. Who's doing most of the unpaid backstage work, ahem, slaves and women, and how Pericles' stricter citizenship law of 451/450 BCE made that velvet rope even harder to get past. This exclusive democracy, funded by an empire and brimming with cultural confidence, has been riding high. But, as any student of history, or even just anyone who's seen a good drama, knows, pride often comes before a rather nasty fall. The simmering resentment from other Greek states, particularly Sparta, about Athens' growing power and its often heavy-handed imperial management, is about to boil over. The Golden Age is about to get a very harsh reality check, because you, my sleepy friend, are now drifting into the long, brutal crucible of the Peloponnesian War. Fasten your seatbelts, it's going to be a bumpy few decades. The war, which officially kicks off in 431 BCE and will drag on with a few uneasy truces until 404 BCE, a mainstream historical fact for you, isn't just a series of heroic battles and noble speeches. It's a grinding, attritional conflict that will test every sinew of Athenian society, especially its much-vaunted democracy. Pericles, still at the helm in the early years, devises a strategy. Athens, with its naval supremacy, will avoid land battles with Sparta's formidable hoplite army. Instead, the rural population of Attica will retreat behind the long walls. Those defensive fortifications connecting Athens to its port city of Piraeus, effectively turning Athens into a fortified island. The fleet will project Athenian power, raid Spartan territory, and ensure supplies keep flowing into the city. Meanwhile, the Spartans can fume and burn Attic farms all they like, it won't break Athens. A neat plan on papyrus, perhaps. But war has a nasty habit of not sticking to the script. Imagine the scene, you're crammed inside the city walls. What was once a spacious urban area is now swollen with refugees from the countryside, living in makeshift shacks, temples, even empty spaces along the walls themselves. Sanitation is a nightmare, resources are strained, and the mood is anxious. You can see the smoke from your burning farm on the horizon, hear the taunts of the Spartan army just outside the walls. It's a pressure cooker environment. And something is about to make it infinitely worse. In the second year of the war, 430 BCE, disaster strikes in a form far more terrifying than Spartan spears, the plague of Athens. Thucydides, who caught it himself and survived, gives a horrifyingly detailed account. It started with burning fevers, inflamed eyes, bloody throats and tongues, leading to violent coughing, retching, and agonizing internal distress. The skin would break out in pustules and ulcers. Many, driven mad by unquenchable thirst, threw themselves into water cisterns. The sheer number of dead overwhelmed all funerary customs. Bodies were piled up in the streets or hastily burned on makeshift pyres. Social order began to break down. People became reckless, indulging in excesses, figuring they might be dead tomorrow anyway. Medical knowledge was useless. Prayers to the gods went unanswered. It's estimated that up to a third of the population, including Pericles himself in 429 BCE, perished. Imagine the psychological impact on a city that thought itself the pinnacle of civilization, now reduced to a stinking, dying charnel house. It's like a zombie apocalypse movie, but with more togas and fewer shotguns. The death of Pericles leaves a gaping void in Athenian leadership. The first citizen is gone. And the figures who rise to prominence in his wake are often a different breed. Men like Cleon, a tanner by trade, are powerful orators, often appealing more to the assembly's baser emotions, fear, anger, vindictiveness, than to reason. This is where Athenian democracy starts to show some serious strain. with the constant pressure of war and the trauma of the plague. The reasoned debate of the ecclesia can sometimes give way to rash, emotionally charged decisions. Consider the Mytilenean debate in 427 BCE. Mytilene, a subject ally on the island of Lesbos, revolted. The furious Athenian assembly, urged on by Cleon, initially votes to execute all adult male Mytileneans and enslave the women and children. A trireme is dispatched with these brutal orders. However, overnight, many Athenians have second thoughts. A second debate is held, a rare and dramatic occurrence. Speakers argue for mercy, pointing out the injustice of punishing the entire population. After a tense debate, the assembly narrowly reverses its decision, voting only to execute the ringleaders. Another trireme is sent out, rowing desperately to overtake the first one. It arrives just in time. It's a moment where democracy pulls itself back from the brink of committing a horrific atrocity. But it also shows how easily it could be swayed towards brutality in the heat of war. One of the most infamous and tragic episodes is the Sicilian expedition, 415 to 413 BCE. Urged on by the dashing, ambitious, and deeply controversial figure of Alcibiades, the assembly votes to send a massive naval force to intervene in a dispute in Sicily, with the ultimate aim of conquering the island and gaining a significant advantage over Sparta. It's a hugely risky gamble, an overreach of epic proportions. Just before the fleet is due to sail, a bizarre act of sacrilege occurs. The Hermae, stone pillars with a bust of the god Hermes and a phallus, which stood throughout the city as protective symbols, are mutilated overnight. This is our quirky tidbit for the section. The city is thrown into a panic. Accusations fly, implicating Alcibiades among others, though his involvement is uncertain. He's allowed to sail with the fleet, but is then recalled to stand trial. Fearing the worst, he defects to Sparta, of all places, and starts advising them on how to defeat Athens. You couldn't make it up. It's like your star quarterback suddenly switching teams right before the Super Bowl and giving away your entire playbook. The Sicilian expedition, deprived of its charismatic champion and plagued by divided command and poor strategy, ends in utter disaster. Almost the entire Athenian force is wiped out, thousands of men and hundreds of ships lost. It's a catastrophic blow from which Athens never fully recovers. The war drags on, and the strains on democracy become almost unbearable. In 411 BCE, with the war going badly and many citizens away with the fleet, a group of oligarchs stages a coup, overthrowing the democracy and establishing a narrow oligarchy called the 400. They argue that the democracy is inefficient in wartime and that a more restricted government would be better able to secure Persian funding. Yes, the old enemy is now a potential paymaster. This oligarchic regime is short-lived, soon replaced by a more moderate, 5,000, and eventually, full democracy is restored. But the episode reveals its fragility. When pushed to the limit, the system could, and did, break. Historians still argue whether the extreme pressures of the Peloponnesian War fundamentally exposed fatal flaws within Athenian democracy itself, or if the system, despite its temporary collapses, ultimately demonstrated remarkable resilience. Was the assembly inherently prone to rash decisions and demagoguery in wartime? Or was it the specific failures of leadership and the unprecedented severity of the crises, plague, disastrous military defeats, that led to these outcomes? The fact that democracy was restored after the coup of 411, and again after the even more brutal regime of the 30 tyrants imposed by Sparta at the very end of the war in 404 BCE, suggests a deep-seated commitment to democratic ideals among the Athenian populace. They'd tasted self-rule, and even in defeat, they wanted it back. As you live through these years, the Golden Age feels like a distant, dreamlike memory. The streets are no longer just filled with philosophers and artists, but with worried citizens, wounded soldiers, and grieving families. The assembly debates are less about grand visions and more about desperate measures. Trust erodes. Scapegoating becomes common. The very fabric of civic life is stretched thin. It's a stark reminder that democracy is not a utopian ideal that floats above the messy realities of human conflict. It is a system that has to function in the real world, with all its dangers and uncertainties. The Peloponnesian War is Athens' trial by fire, and while the city itself will survive, its democracy will emerge scarred, changed, and perhaps a little wiser, though certainly much weaker. The echoes of those passionate, often flawed, wartime debates on the Pnyx still resonate. A testament to a people grappling with existential crisis while trying to cling to their radical experiment in self-government. You've just staggered through the brutal, seemingly endless Peloponnesian War. Athens, once so proud and glittering, has been humbled, its empire shattered, its treasury empty, and its democracy battered and bruised, having even suffered a couple of nasty oligarchic knockouts before climbing back to its feet. The taste of hemlock from Socrates' execution in 399 BCE. A democratic court condemning its most famous gadfly philosopher, still lingers bitterly in the intellectual air. It's a time for soul-searching. The grand experiment of demokratia, which had shone so brightly in Pericles' day, has shown its cracks under pressure. And believe me, there were plenty of sharp minds around ready to poke their philosophical fingers into those cracks and ask some very uncomfortable questions. So, pull up a stool in the agora. Or perhaps recline on a couch at a, hopefully not too rowdy, symposium, because you're about to hear some serious voices of dissent. Not everyone in Athens was a flag-waving, democracy is the best thing since sliced bread, or rather, sliced olives, kind of person. Even during its heyday, and especially after the wartime debacles, Athenian democracy had its critics. And some of them were among its most brilliant thinkers. They weren't necessarily all trying to tear it down, but they were certainly pointing out its wobbles, its blind spots, and its tendency to, shall we say, occasionally shoot itself in the foot with an arrow of popular opinion. Let's start with the shadow of Socrates. He never wrote anything himself, preferring to wander around questioning everyone about everything, justice, virtue, piety, much to the annoyance of those who thought they had all the answers. His trial and execution by a jury of 501 fellow citizens, on rather vague charges of impiety and corrupting the youth, became a major turning point for many intellectuals. If the demos could condemn a man widely regarded, at least by his followers, as the wisest in Athens, what did that say about the wisdom of the demos itself? It's like your town voting to exile its only decent barista. The coffee quality is bound to suffer, and people will ask questions. One of Socrates' most devoted students, Plato, certainly had a lot of questions. In fact, he was so disillusioned by Socrates' fate and by what he saw as the chaotic and often misguided nature of democratic politics that he became one of its most profound critics. This is a mainstream historical fact you can't miss. Plato, in his famous work The Republic, lays out a sustained argument against democracy. He saw it as an inherently flawed and unstable form of government, prone to disorder and ultimately leading to tyranny. He argued that governing is a skill, a craft, like medicine or navigation. You wouldn't let a random group of passengers vote on how to steer a ship in a storm, would you? Unless you particularly enjoyed swimming. So why, Plato asked, would you entrust the ship of state to the whims of the untrained, often ignorant, masses, swayed by persuasive but shallow rhetoric? His ideal state was to be ruled by philosopher kings, individuals rigorously trained in philosophy and virtue, who understood the true nature of the good and could govern with wisdom and justice. For Plato, democracy was just a step above tyranny in his ranking of degenerate political systems, a sort of everyone for themselves party that inevitably gets out of hand. It's a bit like saying the ideal government is run by people who've completed a PhD in good governance, which, while appealing in theory, might make for some very long-winded policy debates. Then there's Thucydides, our clear-eyed historian of the Peloponnesian War. He wasn't a philosopher prescribing ideal states. But his analysis of how democracy functioned, and malfunctioned, under the stress of war is incredibly sharp. He showed how the assembly could be swayed by powerful but reckless orators, demagogues like Cleon, whom he portrays with barely concealed disdain. He highlighted instances where Athenian decision-making seemed driven by emotion, ambition, or wishful thinking rather than a rational assessment of interests. Most notably in the disastrous Sicilian expedition. Remember his line about Periclean Athens being, in name a democracy, but in fact ruled by the first citizen? That itself implies a critique. That democracy worked best when one exceptionally capable individual was effectively guiding it, suggesting the system wasn't inherently stable or wise on its own. His work is a masterclass in observing how political systems, and the human beings within them, behave under pressure. For a slightly less somber, but no less pointed critique, you could turn to the theater, specifically to the comedies of Aristophanes. This is a great quirky tidbit. Aristophanes was the ancient Athenian equivalent of a biting political satirist. Think of him as a classical Jon Stewart or Stephen Colbert, but with more elaborate costumes and perhaps a bit more fondness for jokes about bodily functions. His plays, performed before thousands of citizens at the Dionysia festival, mercilessly lampooned prominent politicians, democratic institutions, and even his fellow intellectuals. In the Knights, he savagely attacks the demagogue Cleon, portraying him as a thieving Paphlagonian slave. In the Wasps, he satirizes the Athenian obsession with jury duty and litigation, depicting elderly jurors as easily manipulated and addicted to judging. In the Clouds, he even pokes fun at Socrates, portraying him as a woolly-headed charlatan teaching students how to make weak arguments sound strong, an portrayal that some believe contributed to the popular prejudice against Socrates that led to his trial. Aristophanes' comedies provided a public forum for criticism, a way for Athenians to laugh at their own follies, but the laughter often had a sharp, critical edge. It's like a citywide roast, where even the most powerful aren't safe from a good zinger. And if you wanted a really hardcore anti-democratic take, there's an anonymous pamphlet often referred to as the Constitution of the Athenians, or more colloquially, the Old Oligarch, though an actual old oligarch probably didn't write it. This fascinating text, written perhaps during the Peloponnesian War, offers a surprisingly clear-eyed, if deeply cynical, analysis of Athenian democracy from the perspective of someone who clearly dislikes it but understands why it works the way it does. The author argues that democracy is designed to benefit the poor and the base elements of society at the expense of the wealthy and the better sort, the aristocrats. He notes, with a kind of grudging admiration, that it's quite effective at achieving these aims. It's a bit like reading a scathing review of your favorite restaurant from a rival chef who hates everything it stands for but has to admit the food is popular. So, what were the common threads in these critiques? A major concern was demagoguery, the danger of charismatic leaders manipulating the emotions of the masses for their own gain, leading to foolish or dangerous policies. There was also the idea of the tyranny of the majority, or the collective will of the demos, even if ill-informed or prejudiced, could crush minority rights or silence dissenting voices, Socrates' case being a prime example for many. Many critics also worried about the amateurism inherent in a system that chose many officials by lot and relied on mass assemblies for decision-making. Could such a system truly possess the expertise and consistency needed for effective governance, especially in complex matters of statecraft or war? Plato certainly thought not. He'd probably look at a modern online poll deciding foreign policy and just sigh into his chiton. Historians still argue about how to interpret these critiques. Were they fair and accurate assessments of democracy's inherent weaknesses, or were they often the biased views of an intellectual elite, many from aristocratic backgrounds, who were uncomfortable with the power wielded by ordinary citizens? Did Plato's ideal of philosopher kings offer a viable alternative, or was it an impractical utopian dream? And how widespread was this disillusionment with democracy among the general Athenian population? The fact that democracy was repeatedly restored after being overthrown suggests that, for all its flaws, most Athenians still preferred it to the alternatives. Perhaps they understood that, as has been said much more recently, democracy is the worst form of government, except for all the others that have been tried from time to time. As you listen to these debates swirling around you in post-war Athens, you realize that the Athenians weren't just practitioners of democracy, they were also its first and most insightful theorists and critics. They weren't afraid to dissect it, to question its foundations, and to expose its failings, even as they lived within it. This capacity for self-criticism, this intellectual ferment, is itself a testament to the freedom of thought that Athenian democracy, at its best, could foster. The system was far from perfect, and the philosophers and playwrights made sure everyone knew it. But the conversation about how to make it better, or whether it could be better at all, was just getting started. You've been through the intellectual wringer, listening to Plato, Thucydides, and even Aristophanes picking apart Athenian democracy, exposing its paradoxes and potential pitfalls. The system, though restored after the Peloponnesian War and the brief but nasty reign of the 30 tyrants, is undeniably changed. The swagger of the Periclean era has been replaced by a more cautious, perhaps more cynical, mood. Athens in the early 4th century BCE is still a major cultural and intellectual hub, but its imperial wings have been clipped, and the old self-assurance is somewhat dented. And just as Athens is navigating this new, more complex reality, a new power is rising in the north, a kingdom of hardy, semi-barbaric, at least in the eyes of some snooty southern Greeks, Macedonians, and they are about to cast a very long shadow indeed over the entire Greek world, including our beloved, if flawed, democracy. As you drift through this later 4th century, you notice the political temperature slowly rising again. Athens has re-established a naval confederacy, the Second Athenian League. But it's a more modest affair than the old Delian Empire, theoretically based on more equal partnerships, though old habits of wanting to be first among equals die hard, you know how it is. There's a sense of trying to recapture past glories, but also an awareness of new dangers. The real game changer is happening up north in Macedon. King Philip II comes to the throne in 359 BCE. And he's not your average horse-loving, wine-quaffing Macedonian monarch. He's a brilliant military strategist, a cunning diplomat, and a master of long-term planning. He reforms the Macedonian army, creating the formidable Macedonian phalanx with its super-long sarissa pikes, basically, a giant hedgehog of pointy death that Greek hoplites found very difficult to deal with. He starts to consolidate his power, expanding his territory, and gradually, methodically, extending his influence southwards towards the fractured Greek city-states. It's like watching a very skilled chess player on a much larger board, methodically taking out his opponent's pieces one by one. In Athens, opinions are, as always, divided on how to deal with this rising Macedonian power. One voice thunders through the ecclesia with increasing urgency: Demosthenes. He's perhaps the last of the great Athenian orators, a man who, according to legend, overcame a speech impediment by practicing with pebbles in his mouth. Try that next time you have a big presentation, though maybe skip the pebbles if it's a Zoom call. This is a great quirky tidbit. Demosthenes delivers a series of powerful, fiery speeches known as the Philippics, denouncing Philip as a dangerous tyrant and urging his fellow Athenians to wake up, resist Macedonian encroachment, and fight for their freedom and the autonomy of all Greek states. He paints Philip as a barbarian menace, a threat to everything Greek civilization stands for. His speeches are masterpieces of rhetoric, full of passion and dire warnings. Are you just going to wait until he's knocking on your door? He effectively asks the often complacent assembly. By then, it'll be too late to order a takeaway, let alone mount a defense. But not everyone agrees with Demosthenes. Other politicians, like Aeschines, argue for a more conciliatory approach. suggesting that Philip isn't necessarily a threat and that Athens should seek peaceful accommodation. Perhaps they genuinely believed this, or perhaps they were, as Demosthenes sometimes hinted, susceptible to a bit of Macedonian gold changing hands. It's the age-old debate: appease the rising power or confront it head-on? The assembly swings back and forth, sometimes stirred to action by Demosthenes, sometimes lulled into a false sense of security or distracted by internal squabbles. The inevitable clash comes. Despite Athenian efforts to build alliances, Philip's military machine proves too strong. The decisive moment. A mainstream historical fact that echoes like a death knell for classical Greek independence, is the Battle of Chaeronea in 338 BCE. The combined forces of Athens, Thebes, and other Greek allies meet Philip's army and are crushingly defeated. The young Alexander, Philip's son, yes, that Alexander, soon to be the Great, plays a key role commanding the Macedonian cavalry. For Athens, it's a disaster. Their army is shattered, and their independence is effectively lost. Philip is now the undisputed master of Greece. He establishes the League of Corinth, a federation of Greek states with himself as the hegemon, leader. The Greek cities retain a degree of internal autonomy, but their foreign policy is now dictated by Macedon. Athenian democracy continues to function, the assembly still meets, the courts still operate, but it's democracy on a leash. Then, just as everyone is adjusting to this new Macedonian overlordship, Philip II is assassinated in 336 BCE. His son, Alexander, barely 20 years old, takes the throne. Any hopes the Greek cities might have had of exploiting a moment of Macedonian weakness are quickly dashed. Alexander proves to be even more formidable than his father. He swiftly crushes a Theban revolt, razing the city to the ground as a terrifying example to others, and then embarks on his legendary campaigns against the Persian Empire, conquering vast territories from Egypt to India. While Alexander is off becoming a legend, the Greek city-states, including Athens, are relegated to the status of provincial backwaters in a vast, multicultural empire. Their old rivalries and alliances seem petty and insignificant on this new world stage. It's like being the star player in your local Sunday league, only to find out the Premier League now includes teams from Mars and Jupiter. Despite this diminished status, Athenian civic life continues. During this period, a statesman named Lycurgus, not the legendary Spartan lawgiver, manages Athens' finances with remarkable prudence for over a decade, rebuilding the city's reserves, strengthening the navy, and overseeing building projects. He's an example of how, even under Macedonian hegemony, dedicated individuals could still work for the good of the city within the existing democratic framework. However, the old spirit of independent, assertive democracy is fading. After Alexander the Great dies suddenly in Babylon in 323 BCE, his vast empire begins to unravel as his generals, the Diadochi, or successors, fight amongst themselves for control. Athens sees a window of opportunity and, alongside other Greek cities, launches a revolt against Macedonian rule known as the Lamian War, 323 to 322 BCE. Led by figures like the general Cleisthenes and inspired by orators like Hyperiades, a contemporary of Demosthenes. It's a final, valiant attempt to regain full independence. Initially, they have some successes, but the Macedonian general Antipater eventually crushes the rebellion. This time, the consequences for Athenian democracy are even more severe. Antipater imposes a settlement that restricts citizenship based on a higher property qualification, effectively disenfranchising many poorer Athenians. He also insists on the surrender of Demosthenes and other anti-Macedonian leaders. Demosthenes takes poison to avoid capture. A Macedonian garrison is installed in Piraeus. This marks a more definitive end to the radical democracy of the 5th and most of the 4th centuries. Historians still argue whether the decline of Athenian democracy was primarily due to the irresistible force of Macedonian military power, or if internal weaknesses, such as political factionalism, a decline in civic virtue, or the economic strain of constant warfare, made Athens ripe for subjugation. Was it Philip and Alexander who killed Athenian democracy? Or had it already contracted a fatal illness from within? Perhaps it was a combination of both. A system already weakened by internal contradictions, and the Peloponnesian War simply couldn't withstand the pressure from a determined and brilliantly led external power. The rise of large Hellenistic kingdoms, with their powerful monarchs and professional armies, simply changed the geopolitical landscape in a way that left little room for small, fiercely independent, citizen-run city-states. As you witness these events, you see the twilight of an era. The Pnyx Hill might still host assemblies, but the decisions made there no longer shake the world. The philosophical schools, Plato's Academy, Aristotle's Lyceum, Aristotle, by the way, was Alexander's tutor, continue to flourish. But the political context that nurtured their birth has irrevocably changed. The flame of Athenian democracy, which had burned so fiercely, sometimes erratically, but always brightly, is now dimmed, overshadowed by the vast empires that will dominate the Hellenistic age. Yet, its legacy, the ideas it pioneered about citizen rule, equality before the law, and freedom of speech, would not be extinguished entirely. They would lie dormant, like seeds, waiting for other times and other peoples to rediscover and replant them. For now, though, a long Macedonian shadow has fallen across Athens. So, you've witnessed the Athenian democratic flame flicker and dim under the long shadow of Macedon. The grand experiment in direct citizen rule, which had roared so proudly on the Pnyx, seems to have been put on a very tight leash, its grand pronouncements now subject to the approval of distant kings and their garrisons. It might feel like the end of the story. A bit of a downer after all that glorious, messy, people-powered action. But the fascinating thing about ideas, especially powerful ones like demokratia, is that they have a habit of not staying buried, even if you build a massive Hellenistic empire on top of them. The physical autonomy of Athens might have waned, but the concepts it nurtured, citizen participation, rule of law, open debate, accountability, well, those were like time-release capsules, just waiting for the right conditions to pop open again. Centuries, even millennia, later. As you drift away from the 4th century BCE, with Alexander's generals squabbling over his vast, crumbling empire, the direct democracy of classical Athens doesn't just vanish overnight, but it certainly transforms. Greek cities, including Athens, continue to have local councils and assemblies. But their freedom of action, particularly in foreign affairs, is severely curtailed. Philosophical schools, like Plato's Academy and Aristotle's Lyceum, continue to ponder the nature of politics and ethics, preserving and developing Greek thought. But the big league of power politics has moved on to larger, monarchical states. It's like your favorite indie band signing to a major label. They're still making music, but the rebellious, independent spirit isn't quite the same. Now, let your gaze drift westwards, towards another rising power, Rome. The Romans, while carving out their own republic, were great admirers of Greek culture. Even if they sometimes looked down their noses at contemporary Greeks as being a bit decadent and overly talkative. The Roman Republic, with its Senate, its citizen assemblies, like the Comitia Centuriata or Concilium Plebis, and its emphasis on civic duty and the rule of law, certainly echoes some classical ideals. However, Roman republicanism was always more aristocratic, more hierarchical, and less directly democratic than Athens at its peak. Think of it as a cousin, perhaps. Rather than a direct descendant, shared some family traits, but a very different personality. Still, the Roman absorption and adaptation of Greek political thought and historical narratives helped to keep those ideas alive in the Mediterranean world. Then comes the long, slow slumber of the Middle Ages in Western Europe. Many classical texts are lost or forgotten. Preserved mainly in the Byzantine Empire, the Greek-speaking Eastern Roman Empire, and by scholars in the Islamic world, who translated and commented extensively on Greek philosophy and science. It's a period where feudalism and monarchy are the dominant political systems in the West. And the idea of ordinary people directly running the state would have seemed about as likely as a peasant's donkey sprouting wings and quoting Homer. Democracy was definitely off the menu. Probably not even in the specials board. But then, like crocuses in spring, or perhaps more accurately, like very old, very dusty books being rediscovered in monastic libraries, the classical world begins to re-emerge in Europe during the Renaissance. This rebirth of classical learning, starting in Italy around the 14th century, brings figures like Plato, Aristotle, Cicero, and the Greek historians back into intellectual circulation. Humanist scholars pore over these ancient texts, and with them, a renewed interest in classical forms of government, including republics and even the slightly scary, to some, idea of democracy. This is a crucial mainstream historical fact. The Renaissance rediscovery of classical political thought laid essential groundwork for later democratic theorists. It's like finding your granddad's old record collection and realizing he had some surprisingly edgy tastes. Fast forward a bit more, and you find yourself in the Enlightenment of the 17th and 18th centuries. This is where Athenian democratic ideas really start to get a second wind, albeit often in a highly filtered and sometimes idealized form. Thinkers like John Locke in England, with his ideas on natural rights and government by consent, and Jean-Jacques Rousseau in France, whose social contract passionately argues for popular sovereignty, the idea that ultimate political authority resides in the people, are deeply engaged with classical models. Rousseau, in particular, admired the direct citizen participation of ancient republics, though he was also aware of their limitations. Montesquieu, another Frenchman, looked to classical precedents and contemporary England when developing his influential theory of the separation of powers, something the Athenians, with their fused assembly, council, and courts, didn't practice in quite the same way, but the general principle of checks on power resonated. These Enlightenment philosophers weren't trying to create exact replicas of Athens. They knew their world was vastly different, but they drew inspiration from its ideals of liberty, citizen involvement, and reasoned debate. It's like ancient Athens became a sort of philosophical mood board for designing new, improved governments. And these ideas weren't just confined to dusty academic treatises. They fueled revolutions. The American revolutionaries, breaking away from British monarchical rule, and the French revolutionaries, overthrowing their own ancient regime, explicitly looked to classical examples. They talked about virtue, civic duty, and the dangers of tyranny, often referencing Athens. Sparta, though usually for its discipline, not its political system, and Rome. The very architecture of their new public buildings often mimicked classical temples, a visual nod to their intellectual heritage. Of course, they were selective. The founding fathers of the United States, for instance, were generally quite wary of what they saw as the excesses of Athenian direct democracy. They worried about mob rule and the instability they perceived in the Athenian model. So, they opted for a republic, a system of representative democracy, with various checks and balances designed to filter popular passions. This is a rather quirky and important point. They admired the idea of citizen sovereignty but were cautious about its direct Athenian application. They wanted democracy, but perhaps democracy with a few more safety rails and a slightly less excitable driver. So, what is the enduring gift of Athenian democracy to our modern world? It's not necessarily the specific institutional arrangements. Our massive, complex nation-states can't really operate like a small city-state where every citizen can turn up for a debate, though wouldn't that be an interesting PMQs here in, say, Westminster? Or even a town hall meeting in, I don't know, Hanoi, if everyone actually showed up. Instead, it's the core principles, the belief that ordinary people are capable of self-government. The ideal of political equality, where each citizen's voice has value, the importance of freedom of speech and open deliberation in reaching decisions. The concept that rulers are accountable to the ruled, and the fundamental dignity of the individual citizen participating in the life of the community. Historians still argue about the true nature and extent of this Athenian legacy. How much of modern democracy is a direct descendant of Athenian practice? And how much is a product of entirely different historical trajectories that just happens to rhyme with classical ideas? Is the democracy we talk about today, with its professional politicians, powerful media, and vast bureaucracies, something Solon or Cleisthenes or even Pericles would recognize, let alone approve of? They'd probably be horrified by the sheer scale, and utterly baffled by Twitter. Yet, those foundational concepts, the demos having kratos, continue to animate political movements and inspire struggles for freedom and self-determination across the globe. The Athenian experiment was flawed, certainly. Its exclusivity, its occasional descent into demagoguery, its imperialistic streak, these are not to be ignored or whitewashed. But its willingness to entrust power to its citizens, its faith in reasoned debate, and its creation of institutions that allowed for an unprecedented level of popular participation. These were revolutionary. They showed what was possible. And that possibility, that ancient echo of citizen voices deliberating under the Attic sun, continues to resonate. A reminder that the quest for a government of the people, by the people, for the people, is a very old, and very human, endeavor. The Athenians didn't get it perfect, not by a long shot. But they got it started. And for that, we, in our own imperfect democracies, still owe them a nod of recognition, perhaps even a slightly sleepy round of applause. And so, our long journey through the birth and life of Athenian democracy, with all its triumphs and its troubles, its brilliant innovations and its very human flaws, draws to a gentle close. You've walked the dusty paths of archaic Athens, felt the tension before Solon's reforms, witnessed the groundbreaking work of Cleisthenes as he reshaped the very idea of citizenship. You've stood with the throngs on the Pnyx, your voice joining the roar of the ecclesia, and observed the diligent work of the bull, steering the ship of state through calm and storm. You've served on those massive citizen juries, wrestling with questions of justice, and perhaps even cast an ostracism, feeling the weight of that peculiar power. You've strolled through the glories of Periclean Athens, seen the Parthenon rise, and listened to the whispers of philosophers questioning the very nature of the system that nurtured them. You've endured the harrowing trials of the Peloponnesian War, felt the shadows of Macedon lengthen, and now, you've traced the faint but persistent echoes of those ancient ideas as they resonate through centuries, shaping the world we inhabit today. The story of Athenian democracy is not just a tale of a distant past, it is a living conversation about how we choose to govern ourselves, about the ongoing, often challenging pursuit of a society where every voice can, in some way, matter. Let the images of those sun-drenched hills, the lively agora, the determined faces of citizens shaping their own destiny, now soften and fade, like a gentle Mediterranean sunset. May your understanding be a little richer, your perspective a little broader, and your dreams, tonight, be peaceful and deep.